She was invisible, just another waitress refilling water glasses in Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, while billionaires laughed and a financial empire quietly burned around them. Nobody saw her. Nobody asked her name. But in 30 seconds, Elena Vale spotted the mathematical error that was about to cost Caleb Mercer his entire company. And the man who created that error was sitting 3 feet from her, smiling. What she wrote on a single napkin would unravel a fraud, expose a monster, and rewrite both their lives forever. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, stay until the very end because what happens in the next 2 hours will leave you speechless. The rain in Manhattan had a particular sound that night. Not the clean drumming of a summer storm, but the tired, half-hearted hiss of a city that had been wet for 3 days straight. It rolled down the windows of Lumiere, the kind of restaurant where a glass of water cost more than most people's lunch, and the carpet was so thick you could drop a fork and it would land like a whisper. Elena Vale stood near the kitchen door, balancing a tray of crystal glasses against her hip, and tried not to look at the clock. It was 9:47 p.m. She'd been on her feet since 2 in the afternoon. Her left ankle, the one she'd twisted on the subway stairs 3 weeks ago, was throbbing in that particular way that meant she'd be limping by the time she got home. Home being a one-bedroom walk-up in Washington Heights that she shared with her father, who would be asleep in the recliner, oxygen tubes coiled around him like a strange, transparent vine. Elena, table 14, pick up the pace. That was Marco, the floor manager, hissing at her in passing. He didn't slow down. He never slowed down. Marco moved through the restaurant like a man late for his own funeral, and he had a particular talent for making Elena feel like she was the reason for it. Yes, chef. Sorry. She didn't bother correcting him on the title. He liked being called chef, even though he'd never cooked anything more complicated than a frozen pizza in his life. Elena adjusted her grip on the tray and started across the dining room. The carpet at Lumiere was wine red and so dark it almost looked black under the low light. The walls were paneled in some kind of imported wood that the maitre d' had once lectured her about. Brazilian rosewood, harvested from a single forest, shipped in sealed containers. The kind of detail rich people paid a premium to know about, even if they couldn't tell rosewood from a 2x4. She passed table 7, where a woman in a dress that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent was crying quietly into a glass of red wine while her husband checked his phone. Table 9, 2 men arguing in low, sharp voices about something to do with Tokyo. Table 11, a birthday. 60 candles on a chocolate tower, the birthday boy looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. And then table 14, the Mercer table. She'd been warned about it before her shift started. Marco had pulled her aside in the back, his hand a little too tight on her elbow, and said, "Listen, Mercer is dropping 40 grand tonight on a private dinner. 40 grand. You do not breathe wrong. You do not speak unless spoken to. You refill, you clear, you vanish. Got it?" She had got it. She had gotten it for the 7 months she'd been working here. Elena had a particular gift for vanishing. She'd developed it in college, then perfected it in graduate school, and now she wielded it like a small, polite superpower. She could clear a foretop of dirty plates and the diners would never quite remember her face. She could pour wine into 6 glasses without anyone looking up from their conversation. She was, in the precise and useful way that waitresses in expensive restaurants needed to be, almost not there. Tonight, she was grateful for it, because table 14 wasn't a normal dinner. It was a war room. There were 6 men around the table, plus 1 woman, and they had taken over the entire back corner of the restaurant. Lumiere had pulled out the partition wall and turned the corner into a kind of glass-enclosed booth, soundproofed, lit by a single low-hanging fixture that made everyone's faces look harder than they probably were. In the center sat Caleb Mercer. Elena had only seen him in passing before tonight. Once, on the cover of a business magazine in the bodega downstairs from her apartment. The headline had been something like "The 32-year-old who bought Wall Street." She'd glanced at it and kept walking. Rich men's faces all blurred together for her these days. In person, he didn't blur. He was tall, even sitting down, long-limbed, lean in a way that suggested he forgot to eat more often than he meant to. Dark hair pushed back from his forehead with what looked like impatient fingers. A gray suit that had been tailored so precisely it looked almost casual. and a face that, even in the half-light, carried the particular tension of someone who hadn't slept properly in a long time. There were shadows under his eyes, a small, fresh shaving cut on the underside of his jaw. His tie was loosened and the top button of his shirt was undone. Not from style, from exhaustion. He didn't look like a billionaire to her. He looked like a tired man trying very hard not to look tired in front of people who were paid to notice. To his right sat a woman in her 40s, sharp-eyed with silver streaks at her temples. Marisol, Elena would later learn, his chief of staff. To his left sat a man Elena would come to hate. Grant Holloway. She didn't know the name yet. She just noticed, in the way you notice the temperature dropping before a storm, that something about him was off. He was perhaps 45. Tan, in the way that men who didn't have time to actually be on a beach paid to look like they had been on a beach. Silver cufflinks, a watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. His smile was generous, broad, and applied to everything. The waiter, the wine man, the air. He laughed at every joke, including his own, and he laughed loudest when Caleb said something that wasn't actually funny. Elena had grown up with a particular kind of man like this, the kind who had bought her father's business with a smile exactly like that. She set her jaw and stepped into the booth. "Excuse me, can I refresh anyone's water?" Nobody looked at her. Caleb had a tablet in front of him, sliding his finger across a series of green and red lines, and he was frowning. The man across from him, Grant, was leaning over a printed binder, narrating numbers with the easy confidence of someone who had been narrating numbers for a living for 20 years. So the Q3 projection comes in at 1.8 billion, factoring in the Hong Kong arbitrage spread and the cross-currency hedge we discussed. Now the model assumes a 4.2% margin of error, which is standard for this kind of structured product. Elena lifted the water pitcher and started to pour. Quietly. Carefully. She had been pouring water for 7 months now, and she could pour around someone's elbow without making a sound. The offshore subsidiary has been positioned to absorb the capital gains tax exposure, which means by the time we close the position in early January, she moved to the next glass. The pitcher was cold against her palm. We're looking at a net upside of approximately 350 million, against a downside risk of, conservatively, no more than 40 million, which is, frankly, an exceptional risk-reward ratio in this market environment. There was a murmur of approval around the table. The other executives nodded. One of them, a young man with a buzz cut and a tie that was too tight, actually whistled softly. Caleb didn't whistle. He kept staring at the tablet. Elena moved to the third glass, Caleb's, and as she leaned in to pour, her eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, to the open binder on the table. There were numbers everywhere, columns of them, equations stacked in tight, dense rows. Most people would have seen a wall of digits and looked away. Elena saw a sentence. That was how it had always worked for her. Ever since she was 9 years old and her father had handed her a chalkboard and a piece of yellow chalk and said, "Show me what's wrong with this, mija." She didn't read numbers. She heard them. They had grammar. They had punctuation. A correct equation had a particular cadence to it, like a well-written paragraph. An incorrect one had a stutter, a missing comma, a verb in the wrong tense. The equation in Grant Holloway's binder had a stutter. She felt it before she understood it. A small, electric jolt in the back of her neck. The kind of feeling she used to get during competition rounds in college when she spotted a flaw in someone else's proof. Her hand froze on the water pitcher. She blinked. She read the equation again, then again. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't a rounding error or a typo. It was a structural mistake, the kind of mistake a graduate student would catch in an afternoon. Grant had set up a hedging model that depended on a covariance assumption, and the assumption was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Inverted. The risk wasn't 40 million on the downside. The risk, if she was reading the rest of the binder correctly, and she always was somewhere closer to 1.2 billion. Elena's hand started to shake. Just a little. A tremor in the pitcher. A drop of water spilled over the lip of Caleb's glass and landed on the white tablecloth. "Christ, watch what you're doing!" Grant's voice, sharp, annoyed. Elena startled, jerking her hand back, and another drop fell. Marco materialized out of nowhere. He was suddenly at her elbow, his fingers digging into her arm. his voice low and flat and furious. "Apologize now." I'm I'm sorry, sir. I'll bring a fresh napkin." Grant didn't even look at her. He waved a hand, the gold of his watch flashing. "Just be careful. This is serious work." Caleb glanced up. It was the first time he had looked at her all evening. His eyes were a strange color. Not blue, not gray, something in between, like the surface of a lake before a storm. They moved over her face for half a second, registered nothing in particular, and slid past her back to the tablet. He didn't see her. That was fine. She didn't expect him to. But as she stepped back, her tray pressed against her stomach, she did something she had not planned to do. Something that, if she had thought about it for even 10 more seconds, she probably wouldn't have done. She looked at Grant Holloway one more time, and she noticed then, for the first time, the particular way his hands moved when he talked, the way he stacked papers, the way he laughed, exactly half a beat after Caleb spoke, as if he was always watching for the moment to perform. She knew that hand. She knew that laugh. She had seen it in a different man, a different boardroom 14 years ago, when she was 16 and her father had come home from a meeting with shaking hands and a piece of paper he wouldn't show her. A buyout offer, a signature, the end of everything. Elena's throat tightened. She turned, walked out of the booth, and went straight to the kitchen. Behind the swinging doors, the kitchen was hot and loud and chaotic. Line cooks shouting, the hiss of the grill, the clatter of plates being plated and replated. Nobody noticed her. She walked past the prep station, past the dish pit, past the back office where Marco kept his clipboard, and stopped at the edge of the loading dock where the rain was sheeting down off the awning in a thin gray curtain. She stood there for a full minute, breathing. In, out. "This is not your business, Elena." She told herself that. She told herself that very clearly. You are a waitress. You are not a math prodigy anymore. You haven't been for 14 years. You don't owe this man anything. He doesn't even know you exist. Walk away. Pour water. Go home. Take care of Papa. But she could see the equation, even with her eyes closed. She could see the cascade of consequences. The hedge would collapse. The offshore subsidiary wouldn't absorb the loss. It would amplify it because the cross-currency exposure was multiplicative, not additive. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the loss would be too deep to unwind. Companies would fold. Pensions would evaporate. Ordinary people, the kind of people who didn't sit in glass booths drinking $40,000 bottles of wine, would lose everything. And Grant Holloway would smile through all of it. Elena reached into her apron pocket. There was a pen. A cheap blue Bic that Marco made all the waitstaff carry. There was a stack of napkins, white linen, the good kind, soft as old paper. She took one out. She pressed it flat against the metal door of the loading dock. And she wrote. She didn't write a paragraph. She didn't write an explanation. She didn't have time, and she didn't have permission, and she knew, somewhere deep in the part of her that had once been a 16-year-old at the International Mathematical Olympiad, that the only language a man like Caleb Mercer would believe was the language of a single, perfect equation. 8 lines of math, 2 corrections. One arrow, drawn neatly, pointing to where the covariance term needed to be flipped. A small notation in the corner. Recalculate downside. Approximately 1.2 billion exposure, not 40 million. E. She stared at it. She almost crumpled it. Almost. Then she folded it once, neatly, and went back into the dining room. The booth was loud now. Someone had ordered another bottle of wine. Grant was telling a story, gesturing broadly, and the buzz-cut executive was laughing too hard at it. Caleb was looking at his phone, his jaw set, his thumb moving across the screen in short, sharp strokes. Elena approached on his side of the table. "Sir," she said very quietly, "your water." He didn't look up. She lifted his glass. There was still a small puddle on the tablecloth from earlier, and she set the napkin down. Not on the table. Beneath the glass, like a coaster. The folded edge tucked carefully out of sight. She set the glass back down on top of it. She stepped back. "Apologies for the spill earlier." "It's fine." He didn't look up. She walked away. She didn't look back. She didn't see the moment, 20 minutes later, when Caleb Mercer would lift his glass to take a drink and notice the corner of white linen poking out from beneath it. She didn't see him pause, frown, set the glass aside, and pick up the napkin. She didn't see his face change, slowly, over the course of 45 seconds, as he read the 8 lines of math on it. She didn't see him glance up, suddenly, sharply, at the dining room, searching, his eyes moving over every face, looking for a waitress whose name he had never asked. By the time he looked, she was already in the kitchen. By the time he stood up, she was on the subway. By the time he asked Marco, in a very quiet, very controlled voice, "Who served our table tonight?" Elena Vale was unlocking the deadbolt on a third-floor walk-up in Washington Heights, kicking off her shoes in the dark, and listening for the slow, papery hiss of her father's oxygen tank. Hector Vale was sleeping in the recliner, the way he always did now. The doctors had said he could still sleep in a bed, technically, but the stairs from the bed to the bathroom were too much for him, and the recliner was 3 steps closer. The trade-offs had gotten smaller and smaller over the past 2 years, until almost everything in their lives had become a calculation of 3 steps versus 4. Elena set her bag down on the kitchen counter. The apartment smelled like the chicken soup she had made him that morning, and faintly like the menthol rub she put on his chest at night. She didn't turn on the lights. She stood for a long moment in the doorway of the small living room, watching him breathe. The cannula hissed, his chest rose and fell. The blue glow of the muted television flickered on his face, on the worn upholstery of the chair, on the framed photograph on the side table. The photograph was old. It was Elena, age 15, standing in front of a chalkboard. Her hair was longer then. She was wearing a sweatshirt that said Columbia across the front, even though she hadn't gone to Columbia yet. Her father, younger and stronger, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, was beaming at the camera like he'd just won the lottery. The chalkboard behind them was covered in equations. She had won the regional Olympiad that day. She had been the youngest competitor. She had gone on to win nationals, then to place second in the international round. And there had been talk, serious talk, from serious people, about a fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Study, about a doctoral program before she'd even finished undergrad, about a future that her father used to describe in this particular voice, low and almost reverent, as if he was talking about a saint. That was all before. Before her mother's funeral, before the buyout, before her father's diagnosis, before the long, slow contraction of their lives into the 450 square feet of this apartment. Elena turned away from the photograph. She went into the kitchen very quietly and made herself a cup of tea. Across the city, in the back of a black Cadillac sliding down Park Avenue, Caleb Mercer was reading the napkin for the 7th time. Marisol, sitting beside him, hadn't said anything for the last 10 minutes. She had watched him read it, watched him put it down, watched him pick it up, and read it again. She had watched his face go through 3 distinct stages: irritation, then disbelief, then something she had not seen on Caleb Mercer's face in the 4 years she had worked for him, which was fear. She finally cleared her throat. "Caleb? What did the napkin say?" He didn't answer for a second. Then he turned the napkin around and held it up so she could see. Marisol Cruz had a master's in mathematical finance from MIT. She did not have Elena Vale's gift. Almost nobody did. But she could read an equation when it was set in front of her, and she could see very quickly what the equation on the napkin was saying. She read it. She read it again. She said in a very flat voice, "Oh my God. Yeah. Caleb, if this is right, it's right." "How do you know?" "Because I checked it 3 times in the bathroom." He passed a hand over his face. The shaving cut on his jaw had reopened slightly, a thin smear of red. "Marisol, Grant has been telling me for 6 weeks that this position is hedged. He has shown me models. He has shown me memos. He has shown me his face sitting across from me, telling me my downside is 40 million. And the actual downside is 1.2 billion. She inhaled. "Plus or minus," Caleb said, "based on a calculation I just got from a waitress." The Cadillac slid through a yellow light. The driver, who had been with Caleb for 3 years and had been trained to hear nothing, heard nothing. "Caleb," Marisol's voice was careful, "are you sure she's not just anything?" He was staring at the napkin again. "Look at the handwriting. Look at the way she set up the recursion. This isn't someone who guessed. This isn't someone who stumbled. She solved it in the time it took her to pour me a glass of water. There was a long silence. What do you want to do? Marisol said. Caleb didn't answer for a long moment. Outside, the rain had stopped. The Cadillac slid past the bright windows of stores that were closed for the night, past doormen standing under green awnings, past a homeless man asleep on a bench with a newspaper folded over his face. The city went on. The city always went on. Two things, Caleb said finally. First, pause the Hong Kong position. Tonight. I don't care how. Wake up Bautista, wake up legal, wake up whoever you have to wake up. We do not close that trade tomorrow. If Grant asks why, you tell him I want a second look. Done. And second, find her. Marisol blinked. Find the waitress. His voice had gone very quiet. I want to know who she is, where she's from, what her name is, where she went to school. I want to know why a woman who can write that on a napkin in 30 seconds is pouring water at Lumiere for $16 an hour. Caleb. Find her, Marisol. Marisol nodded, slowly. Then she pulled out her phone, tapped a contact, and started giving instructions in a low voice. Caleb leaned back against the leather seat. He folded the napkin very carefully along its original creases. He put it in the inside pocket of his suit jacket against his chest, where his phone usually sat. He closed his eyes. He thought, for the first time in a very long time, about how strange the world was, about how a single piece of folded linen could pass between two people who would not have, under any normal accounting, ever truly seen each other, and how that piece of linen could change the trajectory of an empire. He thought about Grant. He thought about the smile. He had known Grant Holloway for 11 years. They had built half the firm together. Grant had been the best man at his wedding. Grant had held his son in the hospital nursery the day Noah was born, 3 years ago, 6 weeks before Caleb's wife Sarah had been killed by a drunk driver on the FDR. Grant had cried at the funeral. Caleb opened his eyes. The Cadillac was pulling up to the gates of his apartment building on Central Park West. The doorman was already moving toward the curb. Upstairs, in a child's bedroom decorated with rocket ships, his 3-year-old son was asleep in a pile of stuffed animals, and a night nurse named Genevieve was reading a paperback in the kitchen. He thought, if Grant did this on purpose, I will end him. He thought, and if he didn't, I still need to find that waitress. Elena couldn't sleep. She lay on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the radiator hiss and her father breathe. Her ankle hurt. Her shoulders hurt. Her hands hurt. In that particular way they hurt when she'd been gripping a tray for 8 hours. She kept seeing the equation. She kept seeing Grant Holloway's hands. Around 2 a.m., she gave up. She got out of bed in her t-shirt and pajama pants, padded barefoot into the kitchen, and turned on the kettle. The blue light of the gas burner flickered. She pulled down the small wooden box where she kept her tea, and her fingers paused. There was something behind the box. A folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, that she hadn't looked at in years. She didn't know why she pulled it out tonight. She just did. It was a letter from the dean of the mathematics department at Princeton, dated March of her sophomore year. Dear Miss Vale, we are deeply sorry to learn of your decision to withdraw from the program. We would like you to know that the door remains open indefinitely should your circumstances change. The kettle whistled. Elena stared at the letter for a long moment. Then she folded it again, put it back behind the box, and made her tea. She thought, I shouldn't have written on that napkin. She thought, I shouldn't have signed it E. She thought, nothing's going to come of it. He'll throw it away. He won't even look. People like that don't read what waitresses write. She thought, in a smaller voice she didn't quite admit was there. But what if he does? Chim. The next morning at 6:14 a.m., Marco called her cell phone. She was in the kitchen, scrambling eggs for her father, who was awake now, watching the news with the volume too low, the way he always did. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and answered. Marco? Elena, you need to come down to the restaurant. I'm not on until 4. Today, now, as soon as you can. There was something in his voice she didn't recognize. It wasn't his usual brisk, irritated tone. It was something else. Something almost careful. Marco, is everything okay? Just come, Elena. There's someone here who wants to talk to you. She felt it then. The slow, cold understanding sliding down her spine like water tracing the back of her neck. She looked across the kitchen at her father. He was watching the morning news. The anchor was talking about a market story, something about a big trading firm, something about a position being unwound in Hong Kong overnight. Her father wasn't really listening. He was just staring at the television, the way he did most mornings, his hands folded over the blanket in his lap. "Who's there, Marco?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Caleb Mercer," he said finally. "Caleb Mercer is here. He's been here since 5:30. He's been waiting for you." Elena set the dish towel down on the counter, very slowly, and stared at the eggs in the pan. The smell of butter rose, soft and warm, into the dim morning kitchen. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and a thin gray light was coming in through the window over the sink. Somewhere on the floor below, someone was running water. Somewhere on the floor above, a baby was crying. Her father, in the other room, looked up from the television. "Mija," he called in his soft, papery voice. "Are the eggs ready?" Elena closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them, slid the pan off the burner, and reached for a plate. "Coming, Papa," she said. "They're coming right now." She did not yet know, could not yet know, that the equation she had written on a napkin 12 hours earlier had already moved more money in a single night than her family had earned in 3 generations. She did not know that a man named Grant Holloway was at that very moment sitting in a glass-walled office on the 42nd floor of a midtown skyscraper, staring at his computer screen with his hand over his mouth, watching a position he had spent 6 weeks engineering quietly evaporate. She did not know that he had, in the last 20 minutes, called 3 different people on 3 different phones, and that none of them had answered. She didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that the eggs were getting cold, her father was waiting, and somewhere across the city, in a too-bright restaurant on a wet Tuesday morning, a billionaire was sitting at her table. She slid the eggs onto a plate. She set them on a tray. She carried them to her father. And then she went to her closet, pulled out the only blazer she owned, and started getting dressed. The blazer was dark blue, slightly too big at the shoulders, bought 3 years ago from a Goodwill on Broadway because her then-boyfriend had said she needed something that looked professional for a job interview at a tutoring center. She'd gotten the job. She'd worn the blazer twice. It had been hanging in the back of her closet ever since, behind the winter coats and the box of her mother's things she hadn't opened in years. She put it on over a white button-down shirt, checked herself in the bathroom mirror for approximately 4 seconds, decided she looked like what she was, a tired woman in a borrowed blazer, and stopped looking. Her father was eating his eggs slowly, the way he ate everything now. The oxygen tank sat beside his chair, and the morning news was still murmuring, and he watched her come out of the bathroom with that particular look he had, the one that was trying to be casual and was not even slightly casual. "You're going in early," he said. "Yeah. Marco needs me for something." He studied her. Hector Vale had been many things in his life. A small business owner, a bookkeeper, a man who could build a cabinet from raw lumber and cook a full Sunday dinner at the same time. His hands were thinner now, and his chest did the work of breathing in a way that sounded effortful, like someone pushing a heavy door. But his eyes were exactly what they had always been. Sharp, dark, patient. The eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime listening to what people weren't saying. "Elena, Papa, the eggs are going to get cold." "Elena, look at me." She stopped. She looked at him. "Something happened," he said. It wasn't a question. "Nothing happened. I just need to go in." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork and went back to his eggs. "Be careful," he said quietly, to the plate. She kissed him on the top of the head, grabbed her bag off the hook by the door, and left. On the subway downtown, pressed against a door in a packed car that smelled like wet coats and somebody's breakfast sandwich. She tried to organize herself. She was not nervous, she told herself. There was nothing to be nervous about. A wealthy man had read a napkin. He probably just wanted to know if it was a joke. Or a prank. Or he wanted to yell at her, which would be fine, actually. She'd been yelled at in restaurants before, and had survived it with minimal damage to her composure. She thought, he's going to ask who showed it to you. As if a waitress couldn't have simply read a model. She thought, he's going to be condescending about it. They always are. She thought, I should have stayed in the kitchen last night. The train lurched. Someone's elbow caught her in the ribs. She grabbed the overhead rail and stared at a chewing gum advertisement until her stop came. Lumiere looked different in the morning. Without the low lighting and the wine-red carpet effect, without the clatter and the heat of a full service, it was just a large room. A bit cold. The chairs were still upside down on most of the tables, legs pointing at the ceiling. The carpet looked more brown than red in the daylight. The paneled walls, the imported rosewood that the maitre d' was so proud of, looked like exactly what it was, expensive wood in an expensive room that mostly served the purpose of making people feel like their money was well spent. Marco was standing near the hostess stand, his clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield. When Elena came through the service door, he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something adjacent to awe, or possibly terror. It was hard to tell. "He's in the back booth," Marco said in a low voice. "He's been here since 5:30. Elena, I don't know what's going on, but whatever it is, just whatever he says, you agree, you nod, you do not—" "Marco, you do not give him any reason to sit." "Marco." She stopped walking. "I need you to stop talking." He blinked. She went past him and walked toward the back of the restaurant. The booth was the same one from last night. The glass-enclosed corner, the low-hanging fixture, the soundproofed walls. In the daytime, it looked smaller. The glass was slightly fogged at the bottom edge. The table had been cleared, but someone had brought a coffee service, a silver pot, 2 cups, a small plate of pastries that hadn't been touched. Caleb Mercer was sitting on the far side of the booth. He was wearing a different suit, charcoal this time, but it looked like it had been put on at 5 a.m. because it was wrinkled at the elbows in a way that a man who cared about his suits would not have allowed. His tie was still loose. Same shaving cut on his jaw, now just a thin, dark line. He had a laptop open on the table in front of him, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at her. Elena stopped in the entrance of the booth. She didn't sit down. He hadn't asked her to sit down. For a moment, neither of them said anything. He was studying her face the way you study a math problem you've been working on for hours. Not rudely, but intently, like he was trying to reconcile something. She had the feeling he'd been picturing someone different, and she wasn't quite matching up with whatever that picture had been. She wondered what he had expected. Someone older, maybe. Someone with the right clothes, the right credentials, the right context that would make the napkin make sense. "You wrote this," he said. It wasn't a question. He lifted the napkin off the table beside his laptop. It had been unfolded, laid flat, the 8 lines of math facing up. In the morning light, her handwriting looked cramped, a little hurried. The arrow she'd drawn was slightly crooked. "Yes," she said, "last night, while you were serving my table." "Yes." He looked at the napkin, then at her. "You were pouring water." "I can do more than one thing at a time." It came out a little sharper than she meant it to. She saw something flicker across his face, not quite a smile. Something caught short of a smile. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She put her bag in her lap and kept her hands folded on top of it. She was aware uncomfortably of the 2 big shoulders of the blazer. Caleb leaned forward slightly. "What's your name? Your full name?" "Elena Vale." "Where did you go to school, Elena?" "I didn't finish." "Where did you start?" A beat. "Princeton. Mathematics?" Something moved across his face. He sat back. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. "What year did you leave?" "Second year." "Why?" She met his eyes. They were the same storm gray she'd noticed the night before. And they were doing that thing she imagined they did in boardrooms. Patient, waiting, not willing to let the question dissolve. "My father got sick," she said. "The business we had at the time was... There were financial complications. I came home." She watched him hear the word complications and decide correctly that it contained a larger story. She watched him decide not to push on it. Not yet. He turned the napkin slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table. "You saw this from across a table, while you were working. The binder was open, the equation was visible. In a font probably this big." He held 2 fingers about a centimeter apart. "The structure was clear enough, Elena." He set his hands flat on the table. "I've had 3 financial analysts look at that same model over the past 6 weeks. My chief of staff has a master's in mathematical finance. None of them caught this." I'm not saying they're bad at their jobs. Then what are you saying? She thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was that she had a gift that didn't make polite sense, that she'd always been able to see the architecture underneath the model, the way some people heard a wrong note in a piece of music. But that was a difficult thing to say to a stranger across a table without sounding like you were being difficult. I'm saying the error is structural, she said. It's not in the numbers, it's in the setup. Your analysts were probably verifying the calculations, not questioning the underlying assumptions. Those are different tasks. He looked at her for a long moment. The covariance term, he said. Yes. Walk me through it. She blinked. Right now? Right now. She glanced at the laptop. He turned it to face her. The model was open. Not Grant's binder, but a rebuilt version, cleaner, spreadsheet format. She studied it for maybe 15 seconds. She reached forward and pointed at the screen, not touching it, just hovering. Here, she said. This term. It's set up to model the relationship between the Hong Kong position and the dollar hedge as positively correlated, which would make sense if markets were moving the same direction. But in the scenario your firm is positioning for, a rate shock combined with yuan pressure, they invert. They move against each other, which means your hedge doesn't reduce risk, it doubles it. She sat back. At a 1.2 billion downside, she said, give or take how quickly you can unwind. Caleb hadn't moved while she was talking. He'd just watched her face. She had the distinct, uncomfortable feeling of being read, carefully, thoroughly, like a document he needed to understand and had limited time to do it. How fast? He said. How fast did I see it? How fast can you rebuild the entire model correctly? She opened her mouth, closed it. Mr. Mercer, with access to the full data set, real numbers, not what Grant showed the table last night. She stared at him. He stared back. I don't work for you, she said. Not yet. I'm a waitress. You were a waitress, he said. You walked into this restaurant this morning, and I'd like to offer you a job. The word just sat there on the table between them, next to the untouched pastries and the empty coffee cup. Elena looked at the laptop screen. She looked at the napkin, still laid flat, her cramped handwriting in cheap blue ink. She thought about the Princeton letter in her kitchen, behind the tea box. She thought about what it had cost her, and more importantly, what it had cost her father, to have a conversation like this one, 14 years too late, at a table that wasn't hers, in a restaurant where she was still, technically, on Marco's payroll. What kind of job? She said carefully. Financial analysis. Starting position, senior analyst level, because you are apparently more qualified than everyone I am currently paying at that level. Full benefits, pension contribution, he paused. And I will need you to come to the office with me this morning, if you're available, because I have a situation that requires someone who can work very fast and without bias. She almost said without bias? But she heard the word the way he meant it. Someone who hadn't been trained inside his firm. Someone who hadn't already been shown the story Grant Holloway wanted told. What's the situation? She said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the napkin one more time. I think, he said, choosing each word with a care that told her this was very difficult for him to say, that someone inside my organization has been deliberately building models designed to fail, not from incompetence, from design. He looked up, and I need someone who has never been inside my building, who has never met my people, and who can look at 11 months of financial data without knowing which names to protect. The restaurant was very quiet around them. Somewhere, a cook was banging something in the kitchen, a rhythmic, distant sound. The daylight on the carpet made it look shabby and worn in a way the nighttime never did. Elena thought about her father's oxygen tank. She thought about the cost of it per month, the machine, the supplies, the home nurse who came on Thursdays, the 3 medications with the 3 different copays. She thought about the number she'd written in the notebook under her bed, the careful column of monthly figures, the total at the bottom that never quite balanced. She thought about the equation in that binder. She thought about Grant Holloway's hands. What's the compensation? She said. He told her. She worked very hard not to react visibly. Okay, she said. Okay, you'll take the job or... Okay, I'll come look at the data. We'll talk about the rest after I've seen what you have. He nodded. He closed the laptop. He reached over and folded the napkin again, along its original creases, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, the same place he'd put it last night. She noticed that. She didn't say anything about it. He stood and buttoned his jacket. He was taller than she remembered from last night, or maybe it was just that last night she'd been carrying a tray and not paying attention to height. He was also, she noticed now in the flat daylight, tired in a way that wasn't just about last night. It was the tiredness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. She stood too. "Do you need to call someone?" he said. "Before we go." "My father." "Take your time." She took out her phone and walked to the far side of the restaurant near the window. She could feel Marco staring at her from the hostess stand, his clipboard still pressed to his chest, his expression the pure, concentrated essence of a man watching something he could not categorize. Her father picked up on the second ring. "Mija." "Papa, I'm going to be late. Possibly very late. Don't wait on me for lunch." "What's happening?" She looked out through the window at the wet sidewalk. A man was walking a dog in the thin morning light, the dog pulling enthusiastically toward a puddle. "I don't know yet," she said. "Honestly, I'll call you later." "Elena." His voice, soft and papery, through the phone. "Be careful." "You said that already." "I'm saying it again." She almost told him then. About the napkin. About Caleb Mercer. About the equation and Grant Holloway, and what she suspected, in the cold, clear part of her mind, was something much larger than a bad financial model. But she just said, "I will, Papa. Eat your lunch, okay? There's soup in the pot." She hung up and walked back across the restaurant. Caleb was waiting near the door, his phone in his hand, typing rapidly. He had a car outside. She could see the black Cadillac, same one presumably from last night, idling at the curb. He held the door open. She walked through. She didn't look back at Marco. She did, in a way she didn't quite mean to, look at the dining room one last time as she passed through the doorway. The upside-down chairs, the brown carpet in the daylight, the table by the window where she'd balanced her first tray, 7 months ago, in shoes that were slightly too small and a uniform that didn't quite fit, telling herself it was temporary. Everything was temporary. The question was just what it was temporary until... The Cadillac smelled like leather and coffee and, faintly, something like a child's grape juice. There was a car seat in the back, pushed to one side, a small stuffed elephant wedged into the corner of it. Elena looked at it. Caleb got in on the other side and didn't explain it, and she didn't ask. They drove downtown in silence for a few minutes. The city was doing its morning thing, the delivery trucks, the school buses, the rivers of people in dark coats moving fast with their eyes down. "You said your family had a business," Caleb said. Not a question. He was looking out his window. "Yes." "What kind?" "My father ran a small financial consulting firm. Family business, basically. He did bookkeeping and tax strategy for small businesses in our neighborhood. He wasn't big, but he was good. He had a loyal client base." "What happened to it?" She looked at her hands in her lap. "A firm came in about 14 years ago and made an offer to buy his client contracts. Told him they would do a better job serving his clients with more resources behind them. They made it sound like a partnership. But it wasn't a partnership. They bought the contracts and dissolved them. His clients got folded into a larger platform that charged them 3 times as much for worse service. Half of them left within a year. By then my father had already signed away everything and couldn't compete in his own market." There was a pause. "The firm that did it," Caleb said. "Do you remember the name?" She turned and looked at him. He was still looking out the window, but something in the line of his jaw had changed. He'd already guessed, she realized. Or he was in the process of guessing. And the fact that he was asking the question at all told her he knew more than he'd said this morning. "Holloway Capital," she said. It was a smaller company then, one of Grant Holloway's early acquisitions. The Cadillac rolled through a light. Caleb didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Grant Holloway has been my chief analyst for 9 years. He's been with my firm almost since the beginning." "I know," she said. "You knew that last night." "I didn't know his name last night. I just recognized..." She stopped. "There's a kind of person who does a certain kind of thing. I recognize the kind." Caleb finally turned from the window and looked at her directly. "And you still wrote on the napkin," he said. "Ignoring a structural flaw in a financial model isn't something I'm capable of." She paused. "It's not a choice. I just see it, like a spelling error in a sentence. He held her gaze. She had the feeling again of being read, but also this time of something being decided. I want to be straight with you, he said. I don't know yet what Grant has done. I don't know if this is incompetence or something worse, but I have a meeting with him at 2 o'clock today and I need to know what I'm walking into. How much data do you have available? Marisol is pulling everything from the past year, server access, original model files, communication logs, everything your clearance level would allow. What clearance level do I have? Mine. She blinked. You have my personal clearance, he said, which is full access to everything in the firm's financial systems. That's not something I give to people I've known for 3 hours. You've known me for less than 3 hours. I know. He said it without apology. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly. It should bother you more than it bothers me. Something crossed his face. He almost laughed. She could see it, the movement in his throat, but it didn't quite make it out. Fair enough, he said. The Cadillac turned off Fifth Avenue and started east. Ahead, Elena could see the building. She recognized it from news coverage, a tall, dark glass tower, the kind that looked like it had been designed to make passers-by feel slightly inadequate. Mercer Capital Group, in clean sans serif letters on the lobby awning. One more thing, she said. Go. I'm going to tell you what I find. All of it. I'm not going to soften it because you're the one paying me. If there's something bad in there, you'll hear it from me directly, and I won't bury it in language. He looked at her. I'd expect nothing less. Some people say that, and then they actually want the opposite. Some people, he said, have never had a woman they didn't know save their company from a napkin. He looked back at the building as the Cadillac slowed to a stop. I'll try to be better than most people. The door opened. The driver was already there. Elena stepped out onto the sidewalk and looked up at the building. The glass reflected a strip of pale morning sky. Her reflection was small and dark in it. The too big blazer, the bag on her shoulder, the face she was trying to keep neutral. She thought, this is either the biggest mistake you've ever made or the thing you've been waiting for without knowing it. She couldn't tell which. She couldn't tell yet. Caleb came around the car and stood beside her. Ready? He said. She was not ready. She was a 30-year-old woman who had been pouring water 11 hours ago and had not slept. Her ankles still hurt. She had not eaten anything except half a cup of tea, and she had less than $40 in her bank account until Friday, which was 3 days away. Yes, she said. They walked in together. The lobby was cold and marble and tall-ceilinged, and the security guard looked up from his desk when he saw Caleb and then immediately looked at Elena with that particular look. The look that said, who is she, without saying it out loud. Caleb kept walking. She kept pace with him. At the elevator, Marisol Cruz was waiting, a tablet already in her hands, a coffee in each hand. She held one out to Elena without comment, and Elena took it with genuine, wordless gratitude. Everything's pulled, Marisol said to Caleb as they stepped into the elevator. I had it set up a separate workstation, private terminal, not connected to the main network. Encrypted log. She paused. Grant doesn't know she's here. Good. He called twice this morning about the Hong Kong position. What did you tell him? That you were dealing with a personal matter and would be available after noon. Caleb nodded. The elevator started to rise. Elena held the coffee with both hands. It was warm, and it smelled like hazelnut, and it was the best thing she'd felt all morning. She stared at her reflection in the polished elevator doors. The blazer, the bag, the face. Marisol, standing beside her, said quietly, the model files go back 14 months. Okay. There are 37 structured transactions. I flagged 9 that looked irregular to me, but I don't have the math background to go deeper than the surface. I'll start with those 9. Caleb said you needed access to communication logs as well. The logs will tell me whether the errors were accidental or designed. How can you tell from email logs? Elena looked at the ceiling of the elevator. If someone makes a genuine mistake in a model, there's usually a trail of confusion. Other people asking questions that don't quite get answered, concerns that get redirected. If it's designed, the logs go very clean. Everyone agrees too easily. No one pushes back. Marisol was quiet for a moment. They go very clean, she said. How clean? Remarkably clean. The elevator stopped. The doors opened on the 41st floor. Elena had been in offices like this before, briefly, a lifetime ago, when she was 20 years old and a professor had taken his graduate students to tour a quantitative hedge fund as an educational exercise. She remembered the feeling of it, the low hum of servers and climate control, the rows of screens, the particular quiet of a place where large amounts of money moved in silence, without ceremony, the way rivers moved, just going, always going, without needing to explain themselves. Mercer Capital was different from what she'd imagined based on the exterior, less flashy. The floor was mostly open plan, analysts in clusters, glass-walled conference rooms, whiteboards covered in numbers. There were no abstract sculptures or unnecessary waterfalls. It looked like a place where people worked seriously. And then she saw Grant Holloway. He was at the far end of the floor, standing by a window, his back to the elevator bank. He was on his phone. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie. His posture tight in a way that was different from last night. Last night he had been all open-armed ease. This morning, seen from behind, he looked like a man bracing for something. He hadn't turned around yet. Caleb steered her to the right without looking at Grant, and they went through a door into a smaller office, a conference room. Glass walls frosted so you couldn't see in from outside. The separate workstation Marisol had mentioned was set up in the corner. 3 screens, a keyboard, a legal pad, 3 pens. Elena sat down. She put her coffee next to the keyboard. She straightened the legal pad. She looked at the screens. 14 months of data, 37 transactions, 11 months of communication logs. She felt the old feeling move through her. Not excitement exactly, more like a kind of settling, a focus. The same feeling she'd had at 8 years old with a chalkboard, at 15 standing in front of a competition panel, at 19 the last night she'd spent in a university library before she got her mother's phone call and drove home and never went back. She pulled up the first flagged file. "I need 3 hours," she said. "You have 2, Caleb said from the door. "Grant meets with me at 2. She looked over her shoulder. He was watching her with an expression that was hard to name, something measured and wary, and underneath both of those, something that looked a lot like hope. She understood the hope. It was the hope of someone who had built something large and good over a long time and was now sitting in the dark, wondering who he'd trusted with it. She turned back to the screens. "Then I'll need the second hour more than the first," she said. She heard the door close softly behind her. She cracked her knuckles, a habit she'd had since childhood, one her mother had always scolded her for, and started to work. The first flagged transaction took her 11 minutes. The second took 8. By the third, she'd stopped taking notes because her hands were moving too fast for notes, and she was talking to herself quietly, a habit she'd also always had, narrating the proof as it built. And somewhere in the middle of the 4th file, she realized she'd finished her coffee without noticing, and her hands were slightly cold, and the world outside the frosted glass didn't exist anymore. Only the numbers, the clean, terrible, irrefutable numbers. Because Grant Holloway was not sloppy. That was the thing she had half expected, that the fraud, if it was fraud, would be clumsy, obvious up close, the kind of thing that looked sophisticated from the outside but crumbled under real scrutiny. It didn't crumble. It was precise. It was layered. It was built like a building, not like a house of cards, with real load-bearing walls and carefully calculated tolerances, designed so that any individual piece could be examined and look clean. The covariance error on the Hong Kong position wasn't a mistake. It was a door, left open at exactly the right angle, that would let a catastrophic loss walk through while looking, to any casual observer, like bad luck. And it had been built that way deliberately. She found the evidence in the communication logs, not in what was said, but in what wasn't. A specific mathematical concern raised in an internal memo by a junior analyst named Ria Desai 11 months ago had been redirected to a dead thread and never answered. Grant's response, she found it, 3 messages deep, was a single line. "Thanks, Ria. I'll review and circle back." He'd never circled back. Ria apparently had not pushed it. Ria Desai, Elena noted on her legal pad. She underlined the name twice. There were 6 transactions where the structural flaw was deliberate. Not all 37. Most of the portfolio was legitimate. But 6, aggregated, represented a total potential loss to the firm of somewhere between $800 million and $1.4 billion, depending on market movement. And they were timed. They were not random. They cohered in a way that told Elena, with the kind of certainty she'd learned to trust in herself long ago, that someone had engineered them to collapse at roughly the same moment. She sat back from the screen. Her neck hurt. She'd been leaning forward for, she checked the clock, 2 hours and 6 minutes. She took a breath. She picked up the legal pad and read what she'd written. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote out what she'd need to say to Caleb. She was concise. She had learned to be concise. Long explanations, in her experience, gave people too many places to escape to. She needed him to understand this in the time it took to walk from this room to wherever he was meeting Grant. She stood up. Her ankle stabbed at her. She'd forgotten about it. She picked up her pad and walked to the conference room door and opened it. Marisol was standing 3 feet from the door, as if she'd been pacing in that exact spot for the past 2 hours. "I need Caleb," Elena said. "Right now, before he goes in with Grant." Marisol looked at her face. She read whatever was on her face. She turned around and walked quickly toward Caleb's office without asking a single question. Elena stood in the hallway and waited. Down the corridor, through a glass wall, she could see Grant Holloway. He'd moved from the window. He was sitting at his desk now, doing something on his laptop. But his posture was too still, his back too straight, the way a person sits when they're waiting for something and they're trying not to show it. He hadn't seen her. She was tucked at an angle, partially blocked by a partition. She watched him. She thought about her father, at 16, coming home with shaking hands. She thought about the letter in the kitchen, behind the tea box, from Princeton. She thought about the 8 lines of math, in blue ink, on a white napkin. She wasn't invisible anymore, and for the first time in 14 years, she wasn't entirely sure how she felt about that. Caleb came out of his office fast. Marisol just behind him. His jacket was off, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked at Elena's face, and then at the legal pad in her hands, and he didn't ask if she'd found something. He just said, "How bad?" 6 transactions, deliberate structural flaws, total exposure between 800 million and 1.4 billion. She kept her voice level. Their time to collapse within the same quarter. The hallway was very quiet. Somewhere a phone was ringing, a distant sound. Down the corridor, through the glass walls, a group of analysts were bent over a table, pointing at spreadsheets, oblivious. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You're certain?" "Yes." "Walk me through it." She flipped the legal pad open and pointed to the first column of notes. Her handwriting was cramped, fast, the kind of shorthand she'd developed in college when she needed to work faster than she could think. The Hong Kong position was the door. Once I found the structural pattern, I searched for it in the other transactions. Same flaw, different instruments. Currency swaps, arbitrage plays, offshore derivatives. All of them built the same way. All of them positioned to fail on a specific kind of market shock. What kind of shock? Fed rate increase combined with emerging market instability, the kind of thing that happens every 3 to 5 years. She paused. The kind of thing that's being discussed right now in policy circles. Marisol said quietly, "The December Fed meeting." Elena nodded. If they raise rates in December the way the market's expecting, these positions unwind, fast. And the hedges Grant built won't protect you. They'll amplify the loss. Caleb looked at the notes. He didn't touch the pad, just looked at it, like he was reading a letter he didn't want to have received. "You said deliberate. Prove it." Elena turned to the second page. Communication logs. Every time someone inside your firm raised a question about one of these models, the thread went dead. Not ignored exactly. Redirected. Grant would respond with something that sounded like engagement, but never actually addressed the math. She pointed. "Here. A junior analyst named Ria Desai flagged a covariance issue 11 months ago on the Dubai currency swap. Grant's response was polite, accommodating, and completely empty. He said he'd review it. He never did." Did Ria follow up? Once. 3 weeks later. Grant told her he'd consulted with an external auditor and the model had been cleared. Elena looked up. "I checked. There was no external audit." Marisol was staring at the legal pad now. Her face had gone very still. Caleb said, "What else?" "The timing of the transactions follows a pattern. They weren't opened randomly. They were opened in sequence, with each one positioned to create liquidity pressure on the next. If the first one collapses, it triggers margin calls that force you to liquidate the second. The second triggers the third. It's a cascade. Designed to take down the entire firm. Designed to make it look like market conditions took down the firm, Elena corrected. The individual transactions all look legitimate. It's only when you see them together, in sequence, that the architecture becomes visible. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He turned and looked down the corridor toward the glass-walled office where Grant Holloway was sitting, perfectly still, staring at his laptop. "He's been with me for 9 years, Caleb said. His voice was flat. Not disbelieving, just processing. The way someone talks when they're working through a problem they don't want to be true. "He was at my wedding. He was in the hospital when my son was born." Elena didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that. Marisol touched Caleb's arm, very lightly. "You're meeting him in 18 minutes. Caleb looked at Elena. "What do I do?" She had not expected the question. She had expected him to take the legal pad, thank her, walk into his meeting, and handle it. But he was standing there asking her, and she realized with a strange jolt that he actually wanted her opinion, not just her analysis. Her read. She thought about it. She thought about the communication logs. She thought about the way Grant had redirected Ria Desai. Polite and accommodating and lethal. "Don't confront him directly," she said. "Not yet. If he knows you found the flaw, he'll cover. He's been building this for almost a year. He has contingencies." "Then what?" "Ask him to walk you through the Hong Kong position again, in detail. Tell him you want to understand the hedge structure before you approve the next phase. Watch how he explains it. If he's deliberate, he'll try to steer you away from the covariance assumption. If he's sloppy, he'll defend it." Caleb nodded slowly. "And if he steers, then you know he's aware of the flaw, which means every other transaction with the same flaw was built the same way." "Intentional." "Yes." Marisol said, "Caleb, if this goes sideways in that meeting, it won't." He said it with a certainty Elena didn't think he felt. He turned to her. "I want you in the room." Elena blinked. "What?" "In the meeting, with me and Grant." "Mr. Mercer, I don't—" "You're the only person in this building who can see the math faster than he can talk around it. If he tries to bury me in language, I need someone who can call it in real time." She looked at Marisol. Marisol's face was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a small, sharp assessment. She was measuring Elena, deciding whether to trust her. "He doesn't know who I am," Elena said. "If I walk into that room, he's going to ask questions. Let him ask. What do I tell him? The truth. You're a consultant I brought in to review the portfolio. He's going to know I found something." "Good." Caleb's voice had gone hard now, the exhaustion stripped away, replaced by something colder. "Let him know. I want to see his face when he realizes someone outside his control has seen his work." Elena looked down at the legal pad in her hands. She thought about her father, 16 years old in a different life, sitting across a table from a man with a smile like Grant Holloway's. She thought about the contract he'd signed because he'd believed the smile. She thought about Ria Desai, whose question had been politely redirected into nothing. "Okay," she said. Caleb nodded once. He turned to Marisol. "Get legal on standby. I want someone outside that room ready to move the second I call." "On what grounds?" "I don't know yet. Fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, something. Just have them ready." Marisol pulled out her phone and started typing rapidly. Caleb looked at Elena one more time. "Stay close. Don't speak unless I ask you a direct question. If he tries to engage you, redirect to me." "Understood." "And Elena—" He paused. "If I'm wrong about this, if there's any chance I'm wrong—" "You're not wrong," she said. He held her gaze for a beat. Then he turned and walked toward the conference room at the far end of the floor. Elena followed. Her heart was doing something uncomfortable in her chest. Not panic exactly. Just the high, thin awareness that she was about to walk into a room with a man who had, in all likelihood, destroyed her family 14 years ago. And he was about to realize she could see exactly what he'd built. The conference room was glass-walled, soundproofed, with a long table and 8 chairs. Caleb went in first. Elena came in behind him and sat in the chair to his right, setting the legal pad face down on the table in front of her. Grant Holloway arrived 90 seconds later. He came through the door with his laptop under one arm and a coffee in his other hand, and he was smiling. The same generous, easy smile from last night. The kind of smile that made you feel like you were in on something good together. He looked rested. His suit was perfect. His cufflinks caught the light. He stopped when he saw Elena. The smile didn't disappear. It just paused. A small hitch, barely noticeable, and then it came back, slightly recalibrated. "Caleb," he said, "I didn't realize we had a third." "This is Elena Vale," Caleb said, "financial consultant. I brought her in to take a look at some of our structured positions." Grant set his laptop down on the table. He didn't sit yet. He looked at Elena with that same assessing friendliness, and she could feel him categorizing her, trying to place her, wondering if he'd seen her before. He hadn't, not really. She'd been pouring his water. "Elena," he said warmly, extending a hand across the table. "Grant Holloway. Good to meet you." She shook his hand. It was warm, dry, firm, the handshake of someone who'd practiced handshakes. "Mr. Holloway," she said. "Please." "Grant." He sat down, still smiling. "What firm are you with, if you don't mind my asking?" "Independent," Caleb said, before Elena could answer. "I wanted an outside perspective, no internal bias." Grant's smile widened slightly. "Smart. Fresh eyes never hurt." He opened his laptop. "What positions are we reviewing?" "Hong Kong," Caleb said. "Let's start there." "Great. Good choice." Grant pulled up a file, turned the laptop so they could both see the screen. "So, as I walked the group through last night, the Hong Kong arbitrage play is structured around a delta-neutral position in yuan dollar futures, hedged through an offshore subsidiary to manage the tax exposure. The beautiful thing about this setup is—" "Walk me through the hedge," Caleb said. Grant paused, just for a second. "The hedge?" "The risk mitigation structure. I want to understand how we're protected on the downside." "Right, of course." Grant's fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up a different screen. "So the hedge is a cross-currency swap, paired with a covariance model that assumes correlation between the yuan movement and our dollar-denominated assets. Essentially, when the yuan moves, the dollar position moves in parallel, and the net exposure stays neutral." Elena watched his hands. She watched the way he gestured to the screen, the way he underlined certain phrases with his voice. Delta neutral, correlation, net exposure. The words that sounded technical and authoritative and meant almost nothing without the underlying math. Caleb leaned forward slightly. "What's the correlation assumption?" Positive 0.87, strong historical precedent. "Under what conditions?" Grant smiled. "Normal market conditions. Standard volatility. Define standard." There was the smallest shift in Grant's posture, not visible if you weren't watching for it. But Elena was watching. His shoulders tightened. His smile stayed exactly where it was. "Caleb, I'm not sure what you're... I'm asking you to define the market conditions under which your correlation assumption holds." Caleb's voice was very calm. "Because I'm looking at a scenario where the Fed raises rates in December and there's simultaneous yuan pressure from Beijing, and I'm trying to understand how your hedge performs in that environment." Grant was quiet for a moment. He looked at the screen. He looked at Caleb. He looked briefly at Elena, and she saw him doing the math. Not financial math, people math, trying to figure out what she knew. "In that scenario," Grant said carefully, "there would be some volatility, but the model accounts for variance. We've stress-tested this." "Who stress-tested it?" "My team. Ria ran the simulations last spring." Elena kept her face neutral. She knew, from the communication logs, that Ria had done no such thing. Ria had asked a question. The question had been redirected. Caleb said, "I'd like to see those simulations." "Of course. I can have Ria send them over this afternoon." "I'd like to see them now." Grant's smile finally flickered, just slightly. "Caleb, they're not here. They're on the shared drive. I'd need to pull them." "Then pull them." There was a silence in the room, the kind of silence that had weight to it. Grant looked at Caleb for a long moment. Then he closed his laptop, very slowly, and folded his hands on top of it. "What's this about?" he said. The warmth had gone out of his voice. Not all of it, just enough that you could hear the frame underneath. Caleb leaned back in his chair. "I'm trying to understand a position you've been telling me is safe. And the more questions I ask, the less clear the answers get. The answers are clear. You're asking for granular detail on a model we've been running for 6 months without issue. 6 months without a Fed rate shock. We're hedged for rate movement. Are we? Grant's jaw tightened. He looked at Elena again, and this time the look was different, sharper. He was starting to understand that she wasn't just a consultant. She was the reason this conversation was happening. "Who are you?" he said to her. "I told you," Caleb said. I'm asking her." Grant didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The shift in his tone did the work. He kept his eyes on Elena. "I've been with this firm for 9 years. I've built half the portfolio we're sitting on, and I've never seen you before. So I'm going to ask one more time. Who are you?" Elena met his gaze. She thought about her father. She thought about the contract, signed in a room like this one, with a man who'd smiled just like this. "I'm the person who found the flaw in your covariance model," she said. The silence that followed was absolute. Grant stared at her. His face didn't change. That was the thing that struck her. His face stayed completely still. No surprise, no confusion, no anger, just a kind of watchful blankness, like a door closing. "There is no flaw," he said. "There is," Elena said. "The correlation you're assuming inverts under the scenario Caleb just described. Your hedge doesn't reduce risk, it amplifies it. Your downside isn't 40 million, it's closer to 1.2 billion. Grant's hand, resting on the laptop, curled slightly. A small movement, but she saw it. "That's not possible," he said. "It's not only possible, it's structural. And it's not just the Hong Kong position. You've built the same flaw into 6 other transactions. All of them timed to collapse in the same quarter." She watched his face. She watched him process the fact that she knew. That she'd seen not just one transaction, but all of them. That she'd mapped the architecture. He turned to Caleb. "You brought in a consultant to audit my work," he said. His voice was very flat now. "Without telling me. I brought in someone who could read a model," Caleb said. "And she read it. And she found something you told me wasn't there." "Caleb, this is—" Grant stopped. He pressed his palms flat on the table. "This is a junior-level misread of a complex hedging structure. I don't know what she thinks she found, but—" "Show me the stress tests," Caleb said. "I told you, I don't have them here." "Then call Rhea, right now. Have her walk me through them." Grant didn't move. Caleb pulled out his phone. He dialed a number, put it on speaker, and set it on the table between them. It rang 3 times. A young woman's voice answered, slightly hesitant. "Mr. Mercer?" "Rhea, I'm in a meeting with Grant. I need you to pull the stress test simulations you ran on the Hong Kong position last spring. Can you send those to me in the next 5 minutes?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, a long pause. "Mr. Mercer," Rhea said slowly, "I didn't run stress tests on Hong Kong. I flagged a question about the covariance setup, but Grant said he'd handle the follow-up. I never got the data to run a full simulation." Caleb looked at Grant. Grant looked at the phone. "Rhea," Grant said, his voice smooth again, controlled. "You're misremembering. We discussed this. You ran preliminary scenarios." "No," Rhea said. Her voice was quiet but very firm. "I didn't. I asked for the data. You told me you'd review it with an external auditor. I never heard back." The silence in the room was crushing. Caleb reached over and ended the call. He looked at Grant for a long time. "Get out," he said. Grant blinked. "What?" "Get out of this building, right now. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full audit of every transaction you've touched in the last 18 months. Grant's face finally changed. The blankness cracked. Something moved underneath it. Not panic, not yet, but a cold, sharp awareness that the floor had just disappeared. "Caleb, you're making a mistake." "No," Caleb said. His voice was very quiet, very steady. "You made the mistake. You made it 11 months ago when you ignored Rhea's question. You made it 6 weeks ago when you stood in a restaurant and told me my downside was 40 million. And you made it this morning when you lied to my face about stress tests that don't exist." "This is one consultant's opinion. This is math," Caleb said, "and the math doesn't care what you think of it." Grant stood up. His hands were shaking slightly. He looked at Elena, and the look was pure, concentrated hatred. Not the performative anger of someone caught, the real thing. The look of someone who'd been building something in the dark for a long time and had just watched it collapse in full light. "Who are you?" he said again. Elena looked at him. She thought about saying it, about telling him that her father had been Hector Vale, that he'd signed a contract 14 years ago with a firm that had destroyed his business, that she remembered. But she didn't say it. She just said, "I'm the person who can read faster than you can talk." Grant's jaw clenched. He picked up his laptop, tucked it under his arm, and walked to the door. He stopped at the threshold and looked back at Caleb. "You're going to regret this," he said. "I already regret it," Caleb said. "I regret that I trusted you." Grant walked out. The door closed behind him. Caleb sat very still for a moment. Then he put his head in his hands and exhaled, long and slow. Elena didn't say anything. She just sat there, her hands folded on the legal pad, and waited. After a long moment, Caleb looked up. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "He's going to come back at you. People like that don't just walk away." "I know." Marisol appeared at the door. She didn't knock. She just came in, her phone in her hand, her face tight. "Legal's ready," she said. "They want a full briefing in 20 minutes. And Caleb—" She paused. Grant just tried to access the Hong Kong position from his remote login. IT blocked him, but he's trying to move fast. Caleb stood up. "Freeze every account he has access to, full lockdown. I want his credentials revoked across the entire system." "Already done." "Good." He looked at Elena. "I need you to write up everything you found. Full breakdown. We're going to need it for legal and probably for the SEC. Elena nodded. "How detailed?" "Detailed enough that someone who's never seen the models can follow the logic. Assume your audience is smart but not specialized." "Okay. And Elena—" He stopped. "I'm keeping you on. Not as a consultant. As senior analyst. Full-time, if you'll take it." She looked at him. She thought about her father in the recliner. She thought about the oxygen tank, the medical bills, the notebook under her bed. She thought about the equation on the napkin. "I'll take it," she said. "Good." He turned to Marisol. "Get her an office. Get her a terminal. Get her whatever clearance she needs. As of right now, she reports directly to me." Marisol nodded. She looked at Elena with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite approval, not quite caution. Something in between. "Welcome to the firm," she said. Elena almost laughed. She didn't. She just said, "Thank you." Caleb left the room, Marisol following. The door closed behind them, and Elena was alone in the glass-walled conference room with the legal pad and the faint smell of Grant's coffee, still sitting on the table where he'd left it. She looked out through the glass walls at the office beyond. Analysts moving between desks, phones ringing, screens glowing, the hum of a place where enormous sums of money moved quietly, constantly, beneath the surface of normal conversation. She had walked into this building 4 hours ago as a waitress. She was leaving it as something else. She wasn't sure what, exactly. The shape of it was still forming, but she could feel it settling around her, the weight and the promise and the danger of it. She picked up the legal pad and walked out of the conference room. Down the corridor near the elevator bank, she saw him. Grant Holloway was standing by the window, his back to the floor, his phone pressed to his ear. He was talking fast, low, his free hand moving in sharp, tight gestures. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see his reflection in the glass, and she could see very clearly the expression on his face. It wasn't defeat, it was calculation. He turned slightly, and for just a second his eyes met hers in the reflection. He smiled, not the warm, generous smile from before, something thinner, colder. Then he turned and walked toward the elevator. Elena stood very still and watched him go. She thought, "He's not done." She thought, "This isn't over." And she was right. By 6 o'clock that evening, Grant Holloway had retained a lawyer, filed a wrongful termination claim, and sent a carefully worded email to 3 major financial journalists suggesting that Mercer Capital Group was experiencing internal instability due to unqualified personnel making reckless accusations. By 8 o'clock, 2 of those journalists had called Caleb's office asking for comment. By 10 o'clock, someone had leaked a partial version of the Hong Kong model to a trading forum, stripped of context, framed to make it look like Mercer Capital was over-leveraged and heading for collapse. The stock price of Mercer Capital's publicly traded fund dropped 4% in after-hours trading. And in a small apartment in Washington Heights, Elena Vale sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and her phone ringing. Marisol, calling for the third time, and stared at the screen in front of her. She'd been writing the breakdown Caleb had asked for, full detail, clean language, step-by-step logic, but halfway through she'd paused and opened a different file. The communication logs. She'd gone back through them, not looking for the redirected questions this time, looking for something else, a pattern she'd only half noticed before, and she found it. Grant hadn't just been building bad models. He'd been positioning himself. Every memo, every email, every carefully phrased response, they were all creating a paper trail that made him look cautious, diligent, and concerned. And they made everyone else, including Caleb, look like they'd approved decisions without sufficient scrutiny. If this went to court, Grant had documentation that would make him look like the responsible party raising concerns, and Caleb like the reckless executive ignoring them. It was brilliant. It was also, she realized with a cold, sinking feeling, not something he'd built in the last 9 years. She pulled up the timeline. She cross-referenced the transaction dates with external events, mergers, acquisitions, personnel changes at the firm, and she saw it. Grant had started building this the same week Caleb's wife had died, 3 years ago. Not 11 months. 3 years of small, careful moves, positioned so that when it all collapsed, it would look like the chaos of a grieving widower who'd lost control of his company, and Grant would be the steady hand who'd tried to save it. Elena's phone buzzed again. Marisol. She answered. Elena, where are you? Home. I'm still working on the breakdown. Stop. We have a bigger problem. Marisol's voice was tight. Grant's lawyer just filed an injunction to freeze the internal audit. They're arguing that suspending him without due process violates his employment contract. If the injunction goes through, we can't access his files. We can't prove anything. Elena's hand tightened on the phone. When's the hearing? Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. That's not enough time to... I know, Marisol exhaled. Caleb's meeting with legal right now, but Elena, if we lose this injunction, Grant walks, and he takes everything with him. Elena looked at the screen, at the timeline, at the 3 years of carefully constructed coverage. He's not just covering his tracks, she said. He's rewriting the story. He's been building a version of events where he's the victim and Caleb's the liability. There was a pause on the other end. Can you prove that? Marisol said. I can map it, but it's not going to be clean. It's going to look like interpretation. Then make it not look like interpretation. Make it math. Elena closed her eyes. She thought about the equation on the napkin. She thought about the 8 lines that had been clear and irrefutable because they were just numbers, no story, no context, just the structure of the thing laid bare. I need access to personnel files, she said. Hiring records, performance reviews, internal communications going back 3 years. Why? Because if he's been building this since Caleb's wife died, there's going to be a record of him positioning himself during that time. Small things. The right meetings, the right memos. I need to see the pattern. I'll get you access. How long do you need? Elena looked at the clock. It was 10:17 p.m. 6 hours, she said. You have 4. The brief is due at 6 a.m. Elena didn't argue. She just said, send me the files. Sending now. The call ended. Elena set the phone down, cracked her knuckles, and opened a fresh document. Her father was asleep in the other room. The oxygen tank hissed softly. Outside, the city was doing its late-night thing. Sirens in the distance, somebody's music bleeding through the walls. The hum of traffic that never quite stopped. She thought briefly about calling Caleb, telling him what she'd found. But she didn't, not yet. She needed to be sure. She needed the math to be irrefutable. The files started coming through. Personnel records, emails, performance reviews, 3 years of data. She started to read. And somewhere across the city, in a high-rise apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the park, Grant Holloway poured himself a drink and made a phone call to a number he hadn't used in 2 years. The man who answered didn't say hello. He just said, I thought you were done calling me. I need a favor, Grant said. What kind? The kind that makes a problem disappear. There was a pause. How permanent? Permanent enough that she stops talking. She? A consultant. Nobody important, but she's seen things she shouldn't have seen. The man on the other end was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is going to cost you." "I know," Grant said. He hung up. He stood at the window looking out at the city, the glass of whiskey in his hand catching the light from the buildings beyond. He smiled, and 41 floors below, a car with tinted windows pulled away from the curb and started driving north toward Washington Heights. Elena didn't hear the car pull up outside her building. She was 3 hours into the personnel files, her eyes burning, her fourth cup of tea gone cold beside the laptop, and she'd just found the thread she'd been looking for. It was in the performance reviews. 3 years ago, in the 2 months following Sarah Mercer's death, Grant Holloway had written glowing evaluations for 4 specific analysts. Not unusual on its surface, except that 3 of those 4 analysts had been underperforming before that period, flagged by their direct supervisors for sloppy work or missed deadlines. And then suddenly, in Grant's reviews, they were exemplary, diligent, trustworthy. All 4 of them had been promoted within 6 months. All 4 of them now reported directly to Grant, and all 4 of them had, at various points over the past 3 years, signed off on models that Elena now knew were structurally flawed. She sat back from the screen and rubbed her eyes. It wasn't proof in the legal sense, but it was a map. Grant had spent 3 years building a network of people who owed him their careers, people who wouldn't question his work because questioning him meant questioning their own judgment. He'd turned Caleb's grief into an opportunity. While Caleb had been barely functional, trying to raise a 3-year-old alone and keep his company from falling apart, Grant had been carefully, methodically positioning himself to take it all. She opened a new document and started writing. Not the clean technical breakdown Caleb had asked for. Something else. A narrative. The timeline of Grant's moves, cross-referenced with internal communications, personnel decisions, and transaction dates. She wrote it the way she'd write a proof, each step building on the last, each claim supported by evidence, the conclusion inevitable. It was 2:47 a.m. when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Hello?" Silence on the other end, not dead air. Someone breathing. "Who is this?" she said. The line went dead. Elena set the phone down slowly. She looked at the screen, then at the window. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor facing the street. The blinds were half open. She stood up, walked over, and looked down. There was a car parked across the street. Dark sedan, engine running, headlights off. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat. She couldn't see their face. She stepped back from the window. Her heart was doing something fast and uneven in her chest. She told herself it was nothing, a coincidence. Someone waiting for someone. This was New York. People sat in cars at 3 in the morning, but she pulled the blinds closed anyway. She went back to the laptop and kept writing, but her hands were shaking slightly now, and she had to stop twice to reread what she'd just typed because the words weren't landing right. At 3:15 a.m., her phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. She answered it this time without saying anything, just held it to her ear and waited. A man's voice, low and calm. "Ms. Vale?" "Who is this?" "A friend. Someone who thinks you should be careful about the work you're doing tonight." Her throat tightened. "How do you know what I'm doing?" "Because I know who you're doing it for. And I know what happens to people who get in the way of certain kinds of business." She stood up, walked to the window. The car was still there. "If this is a threat, it's not a threat. It's advice. You're a smart woman, smart enough to know that some fights aren't worth winning. Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. I'm just someone who's seen how these things end." Elena's hand tightened on the phone. "Tell Grant Holloway that I'm not my father. I don't sign contracts I haven't read, and I don't scare easy." There was a pause on the other end, then a soft laugh. "You should scare easier." The line went dead. Elena stood at the window, the phone still pressed to her ear, her pulse hammering. She looked down at the car. It was still there, idling, a small plume of exhaust rising into the cold air. She thought, call the police. She thought, call Caleb. She thought, finish the report. She did the last one. She sat back down at the laptop, her hands still shaking, and she wrote faster. She didn't know how much time she had. She didn't know what the man in the car was waiting for, but she knew that if she stopped now, if she let the fear take root, she'd never finish, and Grant would win. Not because he was smarter, just because he was willing to do things she wasn't. She thought about her father, 16 years old, signing a contract because the man across the table had smiled and made it sound reasonable. She thought about Ria Desai, asking a question that got redirected into silence. She wrote, "At 4:02 a.m., someone knocked on her door. Elena's blood went cold. She didn't move. She just stared at the door. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. Her father was asleep. The oxygen tank hissed. The apartment was dark except for the glow of the laptop. She stood up slowly and walked to the door. She didn't open it. She just stood there, her hand on the deadbolt, and said, 'Who is it?' No answer. Another knock, harder this time. 'I'm calling the police,' she said. A voice from the other side, a woman's voice. 'Ms. Vale? It's Officer Brennan, NYPD. We got a call about a disturbance at this address.' Elena's mind raced. She hadn't called anyone. Her father hadn't called anyone. 'Do you have a badge number?' she said. A pause. Then the woman said, 'Ma'am, I need you to open the door.' 'Show me your badge. Hold it up to the peephole.' Another pause. Longer this time. Then footsteps walking away. Fast. Elena stood frozen at the door, her hand still on the deadbolt, her heart slamming against her ribs. She pulled out her phone and called 911. 'This is 911. What's your emergency?' 'Someone just tried to get into my apartment by pretending to be a police officer?' The dispatcher's voice sharpened. 'Are you safe right now?' 'I don't know.' 'Where are you?' Elena gave the address. The dispatcher told her to stay on the line, not to open the door, that a unit was being dispatched. 5 minutes later, she heard sirens. She looked out the window. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, lights flashing. The dark sedan was gone. The real officers came to her door 10 minutes later. She checked their badges through the peephole before opening it. They were kind, professional, concerned. They took her statement. They checked the hallway, the stairwell, the street. They told her they'd file a report and increase patrols in the area. They asked if she had somewhere else she could stay tonight. She said no. They left. Elena locked the door, set the deadbolt, pushed a chair under the handle. She went back to the laptop. It was 4:51 a.m. The report was due in 69 minutes. Her hands were still shaking. She made herself breathe. In, out, slow. She thought, "He sent someone to scare you. That means you're close." She finished writing. At 5:43 a.m., she sent the document to Marisol and Caleb with the subject line, "Grant Holloway Timeline, Full Breakdown." Then she sat back in the chair, closed her eyes, and tried to remember how to unclench her jaw. Her phone rang. "Caleb." She answered. "Did you get it?" "I got it." His voice was rough, like he hadn't slept. "Elena, what the hell happened tonight? How did you—" Marisol got an alert from NYPD dispatch. Your address. Something about a fake officer. She told him. All of it. The phone calls, the car, the knock on the door. When she finished, there was a long silence. "Pack a bag," he said. "What?" "Right now. Pack a bag. I'm sending a car. You're staying at my place until this is over." "Mr. Mercer." "Caleb, and this is not a request. If Grant is willing to send someone to your apartment at 3 in the morning, he's not playing by rules I can predict. I need you somewhere I know you're safe. My father, bring him. There's room." She looked across the small apartment. Her father was still asleep in the recliner, the blue glow of the television on his face. The oxygen tank beside him, the photograph on the side table. "He can't travel easily," she said. "The stairs, the oxygen. I'll send a medical transport. They'll bring the equipment, help him down, make sure he's comfortable. Elena, please, just let me do this." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the man's voice on the phone. "You should scare easier." "Okay," she said. "Good. The car will be there in 20 minutes. Pack light. Just what you need for a few days." The call ended. Elena sat very still for a long moment. Then she stood up and started packing. By the time the car arrived, a black SUV, not the Cadillac, with a driver who introduced himself as Marcus and didn't ask questions. The sun was starting to come up, pale and gray and cold, the way New York mornings were in late autumn. Her father woke up confused when she told him they were leaving. She explained it the way you explain things to someone whose world has gotten very small. That she had a new job, that there was a situation, that they needed to stay somewhere safe for a little while. He didn't ask many questions. He'd stopped asking questions 2 years ago, around the time his world had contracted to the space between the recliner and the bathroom. The medical transport team was efficient and kind. They brought a portable oxygen unit, helped him into a wheelchair, got him down the stairs and into a second vehicle. Elena rode with him, holding his hand, watching the city slide past the windows as they drove south, then west, into a part of Manhattan she had only ever seen in pictures. Caleb's building was on Central Park West, the kind of building with a doorman and an awning and the kind of quiet that money bought. They took a service elevator to the 15th floor. The doors opened directly into the apartment. Elena had never seen a space like this outside of a magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the park. Hardwood floors, soft rugs, furniture that looked both expensive and lived in. There were toys in the corner of the living room, a small pair of sneakers by the door, a drawing taped to the refrigerator in a child's handwriting. Caleb was standing in the kitchen, still in the same clothes from yesterday, holding a cup of coffee and looking like he hadn't slept at all. "Elena," he said. He set the coffee down and came over. "Mr. Vale." He shook her father's hand. "I'm Caleb Mercer. Thank you for coming." Hector looked at him with those sharp, patient eyes. "You're the one my daughter's working for." "Yes, sir." "She says there's been some trouble." "There has. I'm trying to make sure it doesn't reach her again." Hector studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right." A nurse appeared from one of the side rooms. "Genevieve," Caleb said, who usually helped with his son but had agreed to make sure Hector was settled. She took over with a calm competence that reminded Elena of the hospice workers from her mother's last months. They set up the oxygen in a guest bedroom on the ground floor, large and quiet, with its own bathroom and a chair by the window. Elena stood in the doorway and watched her father settle into the chair. He looked small in it, smaller than he should have. "Mija," he said. "Come here." She walked over. He reached up and took her hand. "Whatever you're doing," he said quietly, "be careful, but don't stop." She squeezed his hand. "I won't." He nodded and closed his eyes. She left him there with Genevieve and walked back to the kitchen. Caleb handed her a cup of coffee without asking if she wanted it. She took it. It was hot and black and exactly what she needed. "The hearing is at 9, he said. "Marisol and legal are meeting us there at 8:30. Your report is with the judge already. She's reviewing it now." "What are our chances?" "I don't know. Grant's lawyer is good, very good. They're going to argue that we're acting out of panic, that we suspended him without cause, that your analysis is biased because you're a brand new hire with no track record. It's not biased, it's math. I know, but math doesn't always win in court. Stories win. And Grant's story is that he's a loyal executive being scapegoated by a grieving widower who's lost control of his company." Elena looked out the window at the park. The trees were mostly bare now, dark against the pale sky. "He's going to bring up your wife," she said. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I know. He's going to make it sound like you've been unstable since she died, that you're making reckless decisions." "I know," Caleb said again. His voice was very flat. "I'm sorry." He looked at her. "Don't be. He's been planning this for 3 years. The least I can do is see it clearly." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Caleb said, "There's something I need to tell you." "Okay." "If we lose this hearing, Grant gets his access back. And if he gets his access back, he's going to move fast. He's going to liquidate the positions before we can stop him. Not all of them, just enough to trigger the cascade. The firm will collapse. Pensions, retirement funds, my employees' savings, all of it goes down." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. How many people? Directly? About 400 employees? Indirectly? Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands, depending on how the contagion spreads. She set the coffee cup down. "Then we don't lose." "It's not that simple." "It has to be that simple." She turned to face him. "Because if it's not, then what was the point of any of this? The napkin, the analysis, the last 18 hours. If we lose because Grant tells a better story, then the math didn't matter, and I don't believe that." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and picked up his jacket from the back of a chair. "Let's go," he said. The courthouse was downtown, a gray stone building that looked like it had been designed to make people feel appropriately intimidated by the justice system. They met Marisol and two lawyers from Caleb's firm in the lobby. One of the lawyers, a woman in her 50s named Diane Cho, walked Elena through what to expect. The judge is going to ask you questions directly. Answer them clearly, briefly, no elaboration unless she asks for it. Don't get defensive. Don't engage with Grant's lawyer. Just answer the question you're asked. What kind of questions? Your qualifications, your methodology, whether you have any personal bias against Mr. Holloway. Elena's stomach tightened. What do I say to that? You say no, because professionally you don't. You analyzed a model. The model was flawed. That's not bias, that's competence. They took the elevator to the third floor. The hallway outside the courtroom was cold and echoing. Grant was already there, standing with his lawyer near the doors. He was wearing a different suit, charcoal gray, perfectly pressed. He looked rested, calm, confident. He saw Elena and smiled. Not the warm smile from the restaurant, the thin one, the cold one. She didn't smile back. They went into the courtroom. It was smaller than she'd expected, more like a conference room than the TV version of a courtroom. Wood-paneled walls, a judge's bench, a court reporter. No jury, just the judge, a black woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. Everyone sat. The hearing began. Grant's lawyer went first. His name was Mitchell Crane, and he was exactly the kind of lawyer you'd expect a man like Grant to hire. Expensive suit, expensive watch, expensive words. He spoke in the measured, reasonable tone of someone who didn't need to raise his voice because he knew people would listen anyway. Your Honor, this is a clear case of retaliation disguised as due diligence. Mr. Holloway has been a loyal and exemplary employee of Mercer Capital for 9 years. He has built significant portions of their portfolio. He has never been disciplined, never been flagged for misconduct. And yet, on the basis of a single weekend's analysis by a consultant with no track record in the industry, my client was suspended without notice, locked out of his accounts, and publicly defamed. The judge looked at Diane. Ms. Cho. Diane stood. Your Honor, Mr. Holloway wasn't suspended because of a consultant's opinion. He was suspended because he lied to his employer about the existence of stress tests, lied about the risk profile of multiple transactions, and when confronted with mathematical evidence of structural flaws in his models, he provided no credible defense. The so-called evidence, Crane said, is the opinion of a woman who was hired less than 24 hours before my client's suspension. A woman with no credentials in financial analysis, no professional history in this sector, and a documented personal connection to a party that Mr. Holloway's firm acquired 14 years ago. Elena's breath stopped. The judge looked at her. Ms. Vale, is that accurate? Elena stood up slowly. Her legs felt unsteady. Your Honor, my father's business was acquired by a company that Grant Holloway worked for. That's true. But I didn't know Grant Holloway's name until 2 days ago. I didn't apply for this job. I was brought in because I identified a flaw in a financial model, a flaw that is mathematically provable. But you do have a personal connection to a party harmed by Mr. Holloway's previous firm, a connection I had no knowledge of when I wrote my analysis. Crane smiled. Your Honor, this is precisely the problem. Ms. Vale has a clear motive to fabricate or exaggerate flaws in Mr. Holloway's work. She is not a neutral party. The judge looked at the file in front of her. Ms. Cho, your client submitted a report written by Ms. Vale. The report is 93 pages long and contains extensive mathematical modeling. I've read it. It's very detailed. She looked at Diane over her glasses. But Mr. Crane has a point. Miss Vale's credibility is central to this case, and her qualifications are, from what I can see, largely self-reported. Diane glanced at Elena. Elena could see the calculation happening in real time. They were losing. Your Honor, Elena said. The judge looked at her. Yes, Mrs. Vale. May I approach the bench? There was a pause. Crane started to object, but the judge held up a hand. You may? Elena walked forward. Her heart was hammering. She had no idea what she was doing. She just knew that sitting down and letting Crane dismantle her piece by piece was not an option. She reached the bench and said quietly, Your Honor, I can prove the flaw, right now, in this room. The judge raised an eyebrow. Explain. Give me a whiteboard and 15 minutes. I'll walk you through the covariance error in the Hong Kong model. You don't have to take my word for it. You can check the math yourself. Crane stood up. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. So is suspending an executive without due process, the judge said. She looked at Elena. You're saying you can demonstrate in real time that Mr. Holloway's model contains a structural flaw? Yes, and this isn't a matter of interpretation. It's math. Yes, Your Honor. The judge was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at the court reporter. We're going off the record for 15 minutes. She looked at Elena. There's a whiteboard in the corner. Show me. Elena walked to the whiteboard. Her hands were shaking again. She picked up the marker and took a breath. She thought about the napkin, the 8 lines, the clarity of it. She started writing. She didn't explain it the way she'd explain it to a mathematician. She explained it the way she'd explain it to a judge who was smart but not specialized. She walked through the setup of the hedge, the assumption about correlation, the point at which the assumption inverted. She showed the cascade effect. She showed the numbers. It took 12 minutes. When she finished, she stepped back. The judge had been watching the whole time, her reading glasses on, her expression unreadable. She stood up from the bench and walked over to the whiteboard. She studied it for a long moment. Then she turned to Crane. Do you have a mathematician on call? Crane blinked. Your Honor? Someone who can verify or refute this analysis, right now. Crane looked at Grant. Grant's face was very still. We would need time to You don't have time, the judge said. Ms. Vale just demonstrated a proof. If you can't refute it in the next 5 minutes, I'm denying your injunction. Crane looked at Grant again. Grant leaned over and whispered something. Crane straightened. Your Honor, my client maintains that the model is sound and that any perceived flaw is a matter of interpretation, not objective error. The judge looked at the whiteboard again, then at Grant. Mr. Holloway, do you understand the math on this board? Grant stood up. Your Honor, I've been working in financial modeling for 20 years. That's not what I asked. Do you understand the specific proof Ms. Vale just presented? A long pause. I believe her interpretation is flawed, Grant said. Show me where. Grant's jaw tightened. He looked at the whiteboard. He looked at Elena. He looked at Caleb. And he said nothing. The judge walked back to the bench. She sat down. She looked at the file in front of her, then at Crane, then at Grant. The injunction is denied, she said. Mr. Mercer's firm is authorized to proceed with the internal audit. Mr. Holloway's access to company systems will remain suspended pending the outcome of that audit. She looked at Grant. And Mr. Holloway, if I were you, I'd retain a very good criminal defense attorney. She stood. We're adjourned. The courtroom was very quiet. Caleb closed his eyes. Diane let out a breath. Marisol was already on her phone. Grant stood very still for a moment. Then he turned and walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. Crane followed him. Elena set the marker down on the ledge of the whiteboard. Her hands were still shaking. She turned and walked back to the table. Caleb was standing now. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. That, he said, was the gutsiest thing I've ever seen in a courtroom. She sat down in the chair. Her legs were wobbly. I didn't know what else to do. You won, Diane said. She was smiling, actually smiling. You walked up to the bench and won the case with a whiteboard. We're not done yet, Marisol said, looking up from her phone. Grant just tried to access the system again. IT blocked him, but he's trying to move money. Caleb's expression hardened. Where? Offshore accounts. He's scrambling. Good. Caleb looked at Diane. How fast can we freeze his personal assets? I'll have the paperwork filed in an hour. Do it. He turned to Marisol. Get forensic accountants on every transaction he's touched. I want a full audit, every account, every transfer. If he moved a dime, I want to know where it went. Marisol nodded and started typing. Caleb looked at Elena. Come on. We're going back to the office. We have work to do. They walked out of the courtroom together, down the hallway, through the lobby, into the cold morning air. Elena looked up at the sky. It was still gray, still cold, but the sun was starting to break through the clouds in thin, pale streaks. She thought about the equation on the napkin. She thought about her father in the guest bedroom, asleep in the chair by the window. She thought about the man's voice on the phone. You should scare easier. She wasn't scared anymore. She was angry. And anger, she was starting to realize, was a much more useful emotion than fear. They got into the car. Marcus pulled away from the curb. Caleb was already on his phone talking to someone in legal. Marisol was on her laptop pulling up files. Elena looked out the window at the city sliding past. Somewhere out there, Grant Holloway was making calls, moving money, trying to salvage what he could before the walls closed in. But the walls were already closing, and this time, Elena thought, he wasn't going to smile his way out. The forensic audit took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of Elena sitting in a glass-walled office on the 41st floor surrounded by screens and spreadsheets and the particular silence of numbers being forced to tell the truth. 6 weeks of tracing money through shell companies and offshore accounts, through layers of legitimate transactions hiding illegitimate transfers, through the careful architecture Grant had built to make himself rich while making Mercer Capital vulnerable. It was meticulous work, tedious, the kind of thing that required absolute focus and produced very little drama, just hours of cross-referencing account numbers and transaction timestamps, building a map of where the money had gone and who had helped it get there. Elena was good at it, better than good. She had the kind of mind that could hold complex systems in her head and see the connections other people missed. And more than that, she had the anger. The cold, steady anger that kept her at her desk until midnight most nights, kept her checking and rechecking her work, kept her from stopping until every dollar was accounted for. Caleb had offered her a staff. She'd said no. She wanted to do this herself. Wanted to be the one who traced every thread back to Grant's hands. Marisol had understood. "It's personal," she'd said one night, bringing Elena coffee at 11 p.m. "It's math," Elena had replied. "It's both." Elena hadn't argued. By the end of the 3rd week, she'd found $847 million that Grant had siphoned into accounts he controlled. Not all at once. Not in obvious chunks. Just small percentages here and there, transaction fees that were slightly higher than they should have been, consulting payments to firms that didn't exist, bonuses to analysts who kicked half of it back to him in cash. It was brilliant, in the way that well-designed thefts were brilliant. If you looked at any single transaction, it seemed reasonable. It was only when you saw them all together, mapped over 3 years, that the pattern became undeniable. By the end of the 5th week, she'd connected 4 of the promoted analysts to the scheme. They'd all been complicit, knowingly or not. They'd all signed off on models they shouldn't have signed off on, approved transfers they shouldn't have approved, and looked the other way when the numbers didn't quite add up. 2 of them broke when legal approached them with the evidence. They gave statements, named names, confirmed that Grant had instructed them to process certain transactions without standard review. One of them, a 26-year-old named Marcus Lynn, who'd been working at the firm for less than 2 years, cried during his deposition. Elena watched the video later. Marcus sitting in a chair that looked too big for him, his hands shaking, his voice breaking as he said, "I just wanted to keep my job. I have student loans, my mom's medical bills. He said it was fine. He said everyone did it this way." She felt something complicated watching that. Not sympathy, exactly. Marcus had made choices. He'd known on some level that what he was doing wasn't right. But he'd been 24 when Grant had promoted him, fresh out of graduate school, desperate to prove himself. And Grant had seen that desperation and used it. That was the thing about people like Grant. They didn't need everyone to be corrupt. They just needed enough people to be scared. The SEC got involved in week 4. Federal investigators in week 5. By week 6, there were subpoenas, depositions, forensic accountants from 3 different firms combing through the same data Elena had already mapped. They found everything she'd found, and then they found more. Turned out Grant had been running a smaller version of the same scheme at his previous firm, the one that had bought out her father's business. He'd left before anyone caught him, moved to Mercer Capital with glowing references, and started over. Bigger this time. Smarter. Elena had been right about the smile. On a cold Tuesday morning in early December, federal agents arrested Grant Holloway in the lobby of his apartment building. Elena didn't see it happen. She just read about it later in the news. The articles included his photo, the same professional headshot from the firm's website, the one where he looked confident and trustworthy and like someone you'd want managing your money. She stared at that photo for a long time. Then she closed the browser and went back to work, because the audit wasn't finished. The arrest was just the beginning. There were still assets to recover, accounts to freeze, legal proceedings to navigate. And there were the people who'd been hurt by what Grant had done. The employees whose retirement accounts had been tied to the firm's performance. The investors who'd trusted Mercer Capital with their savings. The small businesses whose pension funds had been exposed to the failing positions. Elena made a list of them. All of them. Every person and entity that had lost money because of Grant's scheme. It was a long list. She brought it to Caleb on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after Grant's arrest. He was in his office, on the phone, his back to the door. She waited until he finished the call. "I have something for you," she said. He turned. He looked tired. He'd been working as many hours as she had, maybe more, trying to stabilize the firm, reassure investors, rebuild trust. There were new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago. "What is it?" She handed him the list. "Everyone who lost money. I cross-referenced the portfolio with client accounts, pension funds, third-party investments. This is the full scope of impact." He read through it slowly. His expression didn't change, but she saw his jaw tighten. "How much?" he said. "Total estimated losses, if we hadn't caught it, would have been just over $1 billion. We stopped most of it. The actual losses are around 97 million. 97 million, he repeated. "Yes." He set the list down on his desk. "How much can we recover? From Grant's accounts? About 847 million. But that's money he stole from the firm, not from the clients directly. The client losses came from market exposure on the positions before we unwound them. So the clients are still out 97 million, unless we make them whole." He looked at her. "Out of what?" "Out of the recovered funds. We use Grant's money to cover the losses he caused." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "That's not how this usually works, Elena. The recovered funds go back to the firm. We have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders. And to your clients," she said, "who trusted you, who didn't know Grant was building a fraud underneath them." "It wasn't my fraud. I know, but it was your firm." He stared at her. She held his gaze. "You're asking me to take a financial hit to cover losses I'm not legally responsible for," he said. "I'm asking you to do the right thing." He picked up the list again. He read through it, slower this time. She watched him read the names. Small businesses, individuals, a teacher's pension fund, a nonprofit that provided college scholarships. He set the list down. "I'll talk to the board," he said. "The board's going to say no. Probably. So don't ask them. Just do it." He looked at her with something between amusement and exasperation. "You've been here 6 weeks and you're already telling me how to run my company. You hired me to tell you the truth. This is the truth. If you let those people absorb losses from a fraud they had no way of seeing, you're telling the world that your firm's reputation matters more than their livelihoods. And that's not the company you built." He was quiet. Then he said, "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since week 2 of the audit." He almost smiled. "You should have been a lawyer." "I'm better at math." He nodded slowly. Then he picked up his phone and called Marisol. "I need you to draft a proposal for client restitution. Full coverage of losses from the unwound positions funded from the recovered assets. I want it on my desk by tomorrow morning." Marisol's voice came through the speaker, cautious. "Caleb, the board—" "I know what the board's going to say. Draft it anyway." He hung up. Elena stood there for a moment, not quite sure what to say. "Thank you," she said finally. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I still have to convince 12 people who care about shareholder value that this is worth doing." "It is worth doing." "I know." He looked out the window at the city. "But worth and profitable aren't always the same thing." She left him there and went back to her office. The board meeting happened 3 days later. Elena wasn't in it, but she heard about it afterward from Marisol. It had been, in Marisol's words, a bloodbath. Half the board had threatened to resign. 2 major shareholders had pulled out entirely. The CFO had argued that restitution would set a dangerous precedent and expose the firm to future liability. Caleb had listened to all of it. Then he'd said, "If we don't make this right, there's no firm to protect. Grant didn't just steal money, he broke trust, and trust is the only thing we actually sell." The vote had been 7-5 in favor. It was enough. The restitution payments went out in January. Elena tracked every one of them. She made sure the teacher's pension fund got made whole. She made sure the small businesses got their money back. She made sure the nonprofit could keep funding scholarships. And she made sure that every person who received a check also received a letter from Caleb, personally signed, apologizing for what had happened and explaining what the firm was doing to make sure it never happened again. It was, Elena thought, the kind of thing that wouldn't make headlines, the kind of thing that wouldn't win awards or get written up in business magazines. But it was the thing that mattered. Because the people who got those checks weren't abstractions. They were real. They had names and families and lives that had been quietly upended by a man who'd smiled and stolen and assumed no one would notice. Someone had noticed. And someone had made it right. Grant's trial started in March. Elena didn't go. She'd given her deposition, submitted her analysis, done everything the prosecutors had asked. But sitting in a courtroom watching Grant defend himself wasn't something she needed to do. Caleb went. He sat through every day of testimony, every witness, every piece of evidence. He told Elena later that Grant had barely looked at him, that Grant had sat at the defense table with his expensive lawyer and his expensive suit and his face blank like he was watching something that was happening to someone else. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, wire fraud. 18 separate charges. The sentencing happened in April. 15 years, federal prison, plus restitution for the funds that couldn't be recovered. Elena was in her office when Marisol brought her the news. She looked up from her screen and said, "How long?" 15 years. Elena nodded slowly. She thought she'd feel something more. Relief, maybe. Satisfaction. But what she felt was just a kind of tired finality. The thing was done. The math had played out. Grant Holloway had built a structure designed to collapse under scrutiny, and it had. "Good," she said. Marisol lingered in the doorway. "Are you okay?" "Yeah." "You don't look okay." Elena closed her laptop. She leaned back in her chair. "I keep thinking about the people on that list, the ones we made whole. How many of them have no idea how close they came to losing everything?" "Maybe that's better," Marisol said. "They don't need to know how bad it almost was. They just need to know it's fixed." "Maybe." Marisol studied her for a moment. "Caleb wants to see you when you have a minute." "About what?" He didn't say. Elena found him in his office, standing by the window looking out at the park. It was spring now. The trees were starting to green. The light was softer. "You wanted to see me," she said. He turned. "I did." He walked over to his desk and picked up a folder. "I have something for you." He handed it to her. She opened it. Inside was a contract. Senior partner, Mercer Capital Group. Equity stake, full benefits, decision-making authority on portfolio strategy. She stared at it. "Caleb, you've been here 4 months," he said. "You've rebuilt half the firm's risk assessment protocols. You've trained 6 analysts. You've caught 3 more irregularities that could have cost us millions. And you did it all while finishing an audit that saved this company." He paused. "I'm not offering you this because I feel guilty or because I owe you. I'm offering it because you're the best analyst I've ever worked with, and I want you here, permanently." Elena looked at the contract, at the numbers on it, at the title. She thought about the waitress uniform in her closet. She thought about the napkin, folded in Caleb's jacket pocket. She thought about her father, 14 years ago, signing a different contract in a different room. "I need to think about it," she said. "Take your time." She didn't take much time. That night she sat with her father in the living room of Caleb's apartment. They'd been living there for 3 months now. Caleb had insisted, and eventually Elena had stopped arguing. Her father's health had stabilized with better care, regular oxygen, a nurse who checked on him every day. He still sat in a chair most of the time. He still watched the news with the volume too low, but he looked less gray, less like he was disappearing. She showed him the contract. He read it slowly, then he looked up at her. "This is what you wanted," he said, "when you were younger, before your mother got sick." "I wanted to do mathematics. This is applied mathematics." "It's more than that." He tapped the contract. "It's trust. He's giving you real authority. That doesn't happen by accident." "I know." "So what's the hesitation?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if I want to be the kind of person who works in a place like this, who makes decisions about millions of dollars, who has power." Her father smiled slightly. Mija, you've had power your whole life. You just didn't know what to do with it. What do you mean? When you were 8 years old, you could do math that adults with PhDs couldn't do. That's power. You chose not to use it because you thought being smart made other people uncomfortable. Then your mother died, and I got sick, and you chose to use that power to take care of me instead of yourself. He reached over and took her hand. You've always had the ability to change things. You just didn't think you were allowed to. Elena felt something tighten in her throat. What if I make a mistake? She said. You will. What if I hurt people? You might, but you'll also help people. You already have. He squeezed her hand. The question isn't whether you're good enough for this job. You are. The question is whether you trust yourself to do it right. She looked at the contract. She thought about the teacher's pension fund, the scholarship nonprofit, the small businesses, the list of names that had become real to her over the past 4 months. She thought about Ria Desai, whose question had been ignored. She thought about Marcus Lynn, crying in a deposition. She thought about all the people who didn't have the math, who didn't have the ability to see the structures hidden underneath the surface, who just had to trust that the people in power were doing the right thing. Someone needed to be in those rooms making sure the right thing got done. It might as well be her. She signed the contract the next morning. Caleb shook her hand formally, like they were strangers meeting for the first time. Then he smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd seen from him in months. Welcome to the partnership, he said. Thank you. Don't thank me. You earned it. She started her new role the following week. Caleb gave her a corner office with windows overlooking the park. She furnished it with a standing desk, 3 monitors, a whiteboard that covered an entire wall, and a single photograph on the side table, her and her father, 15 years old, standing in front of a chalkboard covered in equations. She hired Ria Desai as her first analyst. Ria had been quiet since the whole thing with Grant, understandably cautious, waiting to see if anyone blamed her for not pushing harder on the question she'd raised. Elena called her into the office on her 3rd day as partner and said, I read your original memo about the Dubai swap. You were right. Grant buried it. That's not your fault. Ria had looked at her with something like relief. I thought maybe I should have pushed harder. You did push. He shut you down. That's on him, not you. Elena paused. I'm building a team. People who ask the right questions and don't stop asking just because someone tells them to. I want you on it. Ria had said yes immediately. Over the next 6 months, Elena rebuilt the firm's risk assessment protocols from the ground up. She implemented mandatory peer review on all major transactions. She created a whistleblower system that went directly to her and Caleb, bypassing middle management. She ran training sessions on how to identify structural flaws in models. She made enemies of a few older analysts who didn't like being questioned by someone half their age. She didn't care. She was good at this. Better than she'd expected. Not just the math, though the math was still the center of it, the thing she trusted most, but the people part. The managing, the mentoring, the careful work of building a culture where questions were rewarded instead of buried. It wasn't easy. There were long days. There were fights with the board over policies they thought were too restrictive. There were moments when she wondered if she was doing more harm than good, if she was imposing her own trauma onto a system that didn't need saving. But then she'd get an email from someone like Marcus Lynn, who'd taken a plea deal and was rebuilding his career at a smaller firm, thanking her for giving him a second chance when she didn't have to. Or she'd see Ria present a model with the kind of confidence Ria hadn't had 6 months ago. Or she'd look at the client retention numbers and see that people were staying, that trust was being rebuilt, slowly, 1 quarter at a time. And she'd think, this is worth it. In November, almost a year after the napkin, Caleb approached her with a different kind of proposal. They were in her office, late in the evening, reviewing the year-end portfolio. The city was dark outside, the park a stretch of shadow beyond the glass. I want to start a scholarship fund, he said. Elena looked up from the spreadsheet. For what? For students like you, or brilliant kids from families that can't afford Princeton or MIT or wherever they should be. Kids who fall through the cracks because the system doesn't know how to see them. She set down her pen. Why? Because you were one of them. And you almost disappeared. If your father hadn't gotten sick, if you hadn't had to leave school, you'd be teaching at some university right now, or working at the Institute for Advanced Study, or solving problems I can't even understand. And the world would have had that. But instead you spent 14 years pouring water and taking care of your father and being invisible. I wasn't invisible, she said quietly. You were to people like me. He looked at her. I sat 3 feet from you for an entire evening and didn't see you until you put an equation in front of my face. That's not because you weren't there. It's because I wasn't looking. He paused. I want to make sure we're looking. I want to fund full scholarships, tuition, housing, everything, for kids who have the ability but not the resources. And I want you to run it. Elena felt something in her chest, tight and warm, and almost painful. I don't know how to run a scholarship fund, she said. You'll figure it out. You figure everything out. She looked at him for a long moment. Why does this matter to you? He was quiet. Then he said, because I spent 3 years letting Grant Holloway rob my company while I was too grief-stricken to notice. And I didn't notice because I'd surrounded myself with people who told me what I wanted to hear. He gestured at her. You didn't do that. You told me the truth, even when it wasn't safe, even when you had no reason to believe I'd listen. And that changed everything. He paused. I want to find more people like you. I want to make sure they get the chance you almost didn't get. Elena didn't say anything for a moment. She just nodded. They launched the fund in January, the Mercervale Scholarship Initiative. Full rides for 20 students a year, selected not by grades or test scores, but by demonstrated ability to see problems other people missed. They partnered with high schools in underserved communities. They funded mentorship programs, summer internships, research opportunities. Elena interviewed every finalist personally. She asked them the same question her father had asked her when she was 8. Show me what's wrong with this. The first cohort started in the fall. 20 students, 15 different majors, 6 different states. Elena got a letter from one of them 3 months in, a girl from rural Pennsylvania who was studying aerospace engineering. The letter said, I didn't think people like me were supposed to be here. Thank you for showing me we are. Elena kept that letter in her desk drawer. She read it sometimes when the work felt too hard, or the hours too long, or the world too determined to make things complicated. Her father's health improved slowly, not back to what it had been. That was gone, irretrievable, but stable, manageable. He moved back to the apartment in Washington Heights eventually, with a nurse who came twice a week and a new oxygen system and a recliner that was more comfortable than the old one. Elena visited him every Sunday. They had dinner. They watched the news. They didn't talk about the napkin much, but sometimes he'd look at her and smile and say, You did good, mija. And she'd say, We're not done yet. Because they weren't. The work was ongoing. The rebuilding was ongoing. The careful process of making sure the firm didn't just survive, but became something worth surviving. That was ongoing too. Elena didn't think of herself as a hero. She'd never wanted to be one. Heroes, in her experience, were people who did dramatic things in moments of crisis. What she'd done wasn't dramatic. It was math. It was patience. It was the unglamorous work of checking and rechecking and refusing to look away when the numbers told an uncomfortable story. But maybe that was its own kind of heroism. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The kind that happened in office buildings and courtrooms and late-night sessions with a whiteboard and a problem that needed solving. The kind that said, I see what's wrong, and I'm going to fix it, even if no one's watching, even if it costs me, even if it scares me. On a Tuesday evening in early spring, almost 18 months after the napkin, Elena was working late in her office. The building was mostly empty, just the hum of the servers and the distant sound of a custodian vacuuming somewhere on a lower floor. Her phone buzzed. A text from Caleb. Come to my office when you have a minute. She saved her work and walked down the hall. He was standing by the window again, the way he often did when he was thinking. But this time there was someone else in the room. A boy, maybe 3.5 years old, dark hair, curious eyes. He was sitting on the floor with a set of blocks, building something elaborate and precarious. Caleb turned when she came in. Elena, this is Noah. The boy looked up. Hi. Hi, Elena said. Noah went back to his blocks. Caleb gestured for Elena to sit. She did. I wanted you to meet him, Caleb said. He's the reason I care about any of this. The firm, the scholarships, making sure we do things right. He paused. When Sarah died, I thought about shutting it all down, selling the company, taking Noah somewhere quiet and just being his dad, not thinking about models or portfolios or any of it. Why didn't you? Because I realized that what I built here, it wasn't just mine. It was everyone's who worked here. Everyone who trusted me with their money, their futures. And if I walked away, I'd be telling Noah that when things get hard, you quit. He looked at his son, still building with blocks. I don't want him to learn that. I want him to learn that when you see something broken, you fix it, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Elena watched Noah stack another block on his tower. It wobbled. He steadied it carefully. He's lucky to have you, she said. I'm lucky he exists, Caleb said. He's the only good thing that came out of the worst year of my life. He turned to her. I wanted you to meet him because you're part of his story now, too. You're part of what this firm is. And I want him to grow up knowing that the people who do the most important work are usually the ones no one's paying attention to, the ones pouring the water. Elena felt that tightness in her chest again. I was just doing what made sense, she said. That's my point, Caleb said. Doing what makes sense when everyone else is doing what's profitable or convenient or safe. That's not small, that's everything. Noah's tower fell over. He looked at it for a moment, serious, considering. Then he started building again. Elena smiled. She thought about the napkin. She thought about the 8 lines of math that had seemed, at the time, like such a small thing. A risk. A gamble. Something she almost hadn't done. She thought about all the small things that had followed. The report, the whiteboard in the courtroom, the list of names, the restitution payments, the scholarship fund. None of it had been smooth. None of it had been easy. There had been fights and failures and moments when she'd been sure she was in over her head. But she'd done it anyway. And somewhere out there, in the vast indifferent machinery of the world, a teacher's pension fund was whole. A nonprofit was funding scholarships. 20 students were in colleges they'd thought were out of reach. A 3-year-old boy was building towers, and his father was teaching him that broken things could be fixed. That was worth something. That was worth everything. Elena stood up. I should get back to work. One more thing, Caleb said. He walked to his desk and pulled out a small frame. Inside was a napkin, preserved under glass. 8 lines of math in blue ink. An arrow. A note in the corner. I'm having this hung in the lobby, he said. With a plaque. The equation that saved the firm. Elena stared at it. You're joking. I'm not. Caleb, that's a reminder, he said, that the most important solutions usually come from the least expected places, that you don't need credentials or permission to see the truth. You just need to be willing to write it down. He handed her the frame. She held it carefully, like something fragile. Thank you, she said. Thank you, he said, for everything. She walked back to her office with the framed napkin in her hands. She set it on her desk, next to the photograph of her and her father. Outside, the city was still moving. Lights in windows, cars on streets, people living their lives, most of them unaware that somewhere above them, in a glass tower overlooking the park, a woman who used to be invisible was making sure the numbers added up right. Elena sat down at her desk. She opened her laptop. She had work to do. She always had work to do. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt like the work mattered. Not just to her, to people whose names she'd never know, whose faces she'd never see, whose lives intersected with hers only through the silent language of numbers and trust. She thought about the man on the phone months ago, telling her she should scare easier. She thought about Grant Holloway, sitting in a federal prison, his smile finally gone. She thought about the girl from Pennsylvania, writing to say thank you for showing her she belonged. And she thought about her father all those years ago, handing her a piece of chalk and saying, show me what's wrong with this. She'd been showing people ever since. And she wasn't planning to stop, because the world was full of equations that didn't balance, structures that looked solid until you checked the math, people who smiled while building traps in the dark. Someone needed to see them. Someone needed to call them out. Someone needed to write the truth on a napkin and slide it under a glass and refuse to stay invisible. Elena Vale had been that someone once. She was still that someone now, and she would be that someone tomorrow. The work was never finished. The numbers never stopped needing to be checked. The powerful never stopped assuming no one was watching. But she was watching, and that, she thought, was enough. She turned back to her screen and started typing. In the corner of the office, the napkin sat in its frame, 8 lines of math preserved under glass. A reminder, a promise, a proof that sometimes all it takes to change the world is someone willing to write down what they see and refuse to look away, even when they're scared, even when they're invisible, even when no one asked, especially then.